Cat to the Chase. The Hill Cozy Mystery. Cozy Hill Mystery Series Book 3. Written by Catherine Waltan. Narrated by Allison Liu. Chapter 1. The green of the new leaves outside Gunderson's panoramic windows was incredibly vivid after the spring rain. Sunlight hit the trees and conjured a surreal brilliance. With the lush foliage, fed by the humid climate of the town of green weather, Gwen Paris especially loved spring. Even after the blossoms of the red buds, the wild rhododendron, and the various fruit trees were spent, the richness remained. There was something special in each season, but spring just might be Gwen's favorite. Life could not be simpler. Quin could very well work at home, a few blocks away, but since her work was portable and she could set up anywhere, Gunderson's was her preference. It made her feel like she had a day. There was something unsatisfying about waking up and walking someplace to sit at a desk for 10 hours only to walk back to bed. It made good sleep nearly impossible. She loved her grandmother with whom she lived and had no problem spending endless time with her, but Grandma Robbie asked her too often if she was hungry or had heard the latest. Gwen needed the little getaway. It was no more than a 2-minute drive or a 20-minute walk, but just enough of a commute to do the trick. But even at Gunderson's, there were interruptions. Kevin Pearson, the owner and also the chief mechanic on the garage side of the half-eatery, half-garage and gas station that Gunderson's was, tended to stop by a little too frequently when she was there. Gwen knew this because Mrs. Donaldson, a member of the Town of Green Welcoming Committee, pointed it out every single time. Behind the counter, Jolene laughed. Gwen was convinced that was all she did besides fill food and drink orders. "He likes you," Mrs. Donaldson noted. At first, she did so directly to Gwen, but then she made her remarks to the other women in the welcoming committee, a collection of 60-somethings Kevin referred to privately as the Hen Party. It wouldn't be a bad thing if Mrs. Donaldson was right, and the tall, gorgeous, thoughtful Kevin did like Gwen. At this point, she held little hope, and would be Mrs. Donaldson's age before he admitted it. There was no question that Gwen and Kevin had a special relationship. He was a frequent guest at her home and ate many a meal, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, made by Grandma Robbie. He uncomplainingly performed honeydew tasks. Gwen knew that he wasn't availing himself to anyone else the way he did her. Sometimes she felt a spark between them, but mostly it felt like he was her brother sharing Sunday dinner. "Sigh," said Gwen out loud. Though the welcoming committee bantered with grating cacophony, her thinking out loud riveted the attention of everyone in the coffee shop. Kevin stirred his freshened cup of coffee and looked Gwen's way. "Stuck on something?" he asked with a tilt of his head. "Tough website?" He ambled over to her. She thought he looked like a model walking slow-mo on a runway. She didn't dare confess that she wished he'd get off the fence where she was concerned. Gwen quickly changed the subject, pointing out the window. "Look!" she directed. She only meant it to be a fake-out, but there was actually something to see. A line of cargo trucks climbing the lone road up Perryville Foothills to what appeared to be Brightston Mansion. "What the heck?" asked Gwen, this time for real. "Yeah, they were just through here," said Kevin casually. "Really?" asked Gwen, genuinely surprised. "How the heck did we miss that? Even from a distance, those trucks look like beasts." "Maybe they are." He grinned and wiggled his eyebrows. Gwen pressed her back against the wall-length bench seat she preferred to sit in. Was Kevin talking magic? "Huh?" she asked, studying him. Then she turned her attention out the window again. There were more trucks, and she pegged it. They looked like beasts, like a caravan of elephants. Even from a distance, they were enormous. She looked at the covered gas station bays and wondered how it would work for a truck of their size to fill up. Kevin grinned. He must have read her mind. They just park askew and block the flow of traffic and buy a lot of gas. Amulet Payne emerged from the men's room, as though he had simply materialized. He very well could have. He was dressed in a mix of colonial-aged and modern styles. He wore an embroidered silk coat and t-shirt over denim jeans. On his feet, he sported pointy shoes with silk uppers and ornamental clips. He could pass as an artist of some kind, but that wasn't why he was dressed that way. Amulet had at one time been Gwen's pet, whom she called Emmy, and had only recently been relieved of a curse that had consigned him to be a cat for the past couple 100 years. It still took some getting used to him in his human form. She hadn't noticed his coming into the diner, and he was pretty hard to miss. Gwen did a double take. "When did you get here?" she asked. "I've just arrived," he replied, moping. Gwen could not recall Emmy ever being anything but vivacious. His being in a mood was not like him. "What's with you?" she asked. "Where's your cat?" he replied with an unequivocal mocking tone. "Answer a question with a question," said Gwen. "Nice dodge." The bright blue sky turned slate gray with the promise of rain. Gwen counted 10 trucks. "It's like a military action," she remarked. "Did you talk to any of the truck drivers?" "No," said Kevin. "I was in the garage." They turned onto a private road. "Where could they be going?" asked Gwen. Now the welcoming committee members were chattering about it. "Into a compound of some kind," remarked one member. Gwen focused. "What compound is around here?" asked another. "A commune," said Mrs. Dawson. "That's what I meant. And a secret one. That's why we haven't heard of it." "Oh," said Mrs. Donaldson with a nod. "We should call the mayor." Emmy rolled his eyes, but mercifully none of the older ladies saw. He placed a drink order. "Brewed catnip, please," he asked, then turned to Gwen. "So no on the cat?" "I've tried carrying him around," she answered. "I think he's too young." "He's too something," Emmy mumbled. Now he was dissing her rescue kitten, Divinity. She did replace him awfully quickly. Maybe he was jealous. After all, when he was her cat, she carried him everywhere. She simply lifted the lid of a bicycle basket, and he happily leaped in. And then one day, while mulling over some thoughts out loud, he replied. He disclosed that he could talk. He couldn't say that he had been a human condemned to a cat form by a high-maintenance witch who got her nose out of joint, that he had liked the ladies a little too much. When the spell was reversed, Emmy moved out to a mansion in the coveted neighborhood, The Hill. That would make most people happy. But at the moment, Emmy was a grump. "Hey, this is not like you," she remarked. He took his tea and glided over to her table. "Can we not have conversations from across the room, please, and thank you, especially with the human tape recorders present?" he requested, meaning the welcoming committee members. "Okay," she said, taken aback at his tone. Everyone was entitled, she figured. She accepted that Emmy was in a bad mood and wasn't going to share with her why. She would stop pressing. "So, Kev," she said, "how is it I missed a truck of that size here at the gas station?" "Maybe if you were working as you should be," Emmy offered dryly. "Okay," said Gwen, done tolerating Emmy's mood. That was definitely a zinger. "Look," directed Mrs. Donaldson. "They're all turning." Emmy rolled his eyes again and uttered, "We know." That's right about where Brightston Mansion is. Remember how magnificent it was back in the day? They couldn't have turned that into a compound, could they? No, replied Emmy firmly, and then softly under his breath added, again with the compound. Do you know something? Mrs. Donaldson asked. To Gwen's surprise, Emmy replied civilly. He said, Brightston Mansion happens to be a family home. At present, my cousin is renovating it. Hence the ostentatious caravan of supplies. The structure was left to fail. He has his work cut out for him. This cousin, does he have a first name? Asked Mrs. Donaldson eagerly. He has a first and a surname. Derek Payne, Emmy replied royally. Payne! Mrs. Donaldson echoed like she just won bingo. Like you! Like me, Emmy replied sarcastically. Well, she persisted, could you get an introduction for us? We would like to welcome him. It was obvious to Gwen and to Kevin, who lingered around the coffee shop cash register. The topic annoyed Emmy. She knew Kevin sensed this because he gave her a look. Well, Kevin said, I have to be getting back to work. I should say so, Mrs. Donaldson concurred haughtily. Kevin laughed fully, flashing his perfect white teeth. Well, I do own the place, Mrs. Donaldson, he said. Whether I am standing here or under a hood, I am working, thank you very much. She cut her eyes to Gwen, admonishingly. She snorted indignantly. Gwen scoffed and shook her head. What the hey? She asked. On the sly, as he slipped through the doorway to the garage side of his establishment, Kevin motioned for Gwen to join him. She was hoping that Emmy would sit next to her at her table/makeshift desk, but the invite to spend a few moments with Kevin was way more appealing. She felt safe leaving her computer unattended. She scurried to Kevin, ducking into his office and closing the door behind them. Do you think the Hen Party is talking about us right now? He smirked. Do you think Mrs. Donaldson is going to dock my time card? Can you believe that? I should get back to work. When do you think was the last time she earned a paycheck? There, Gwen chuckled. She eased into the visitor chair across from him. So that was weird, right? He asked. It just wasn't me? No, you're definitely weird, she teased. While she held a conversation out loud with him, she had a private one with him in her head. She was flattered he invited her to hang out, for there was something incredibly comforting about being with him. But there were moments when it felt their relationship could transition from a chummy one to a romantic one. Alas, there was something holding them back. Gwen had been shy in this regard, for she sort of hoped he would make the first move. No, but seriously, he said, brushing off her humor. What is it with the little old ladies lately in the town of Green? Of course, he was referring to a series of incidents in recent history at which he was the center, where little old ladies, indeed, played a pivotal role. In one situation, he had been duped by one woman who hacked his business and swiped funds, and in another had actually been kidnapped. But it was all water over the dam for him. Everything resolved and reverted to normal. That was the charm of the town of Green. It was mostly a cozy, comfortable small town where citizens with roots that reached back hundreds of years took things in stride. For the most part, drama was few and far between, so taking things as they came was easy to do. Not sure, said Gwen. I guess you just attract their attention. Maybe your virility frustrates them. Why, Gwendolyn, he kidded. Kevin's phone dinged. Speaking of little ladies, he said, reading his message, Grandma Robbie has invited me to dinner. She pretended to protest. Since when do you call her Grandma Robbie? She was always Roberta to you. No, he argued in good nature. I believe I always called her at least Gram, like you. I call her Gram because she's my grandmother, Kev. She laughed, though part of her was jealous, and she wasn't sure if it was of her grandmother or him. Her grandmother had an easier relationship with Kevin than perhaps she did. He continued to scroll through and chuckle at her message. Gwen huffed. Oh, corn's sake, she declared. She doesn't even text me. Do you have your phone? He asked pointedly. No, she replied. I left it at the table. He arched a brow. That's not wise. Come on, look where we are, she replied. He lectured mildly. Who are you talking to? We live in a fine place, but stuff happens. You have a hen squad out there who see fit to dictate my work habits. You don't think one of them would snoop in your electronics? Okay, she consented, touching the back of her palm to her forehead. I know when I am not wanted. Milady, he said sensually, that is not at all my meaning. Gwen could have melted. Those were the crumbs that kept her hanging on, not that she had other offers. She glided back to her niche in the bench seat. Emmy was there in her place. You left this wide open for the world to see, he said, picking up where Kevin left off. I know, she agreed. I had not intended to be so long in Kevin's office. Mrs. Donaldson sounded with disapproval. Okay, I think I am done, said Gwen, up to her ears in Mrs. Donaldson for the day. Now who is being overdramatic? Emmy murmured. Are you going to tell me what's going on with you? She asked. Emmy split a packet of raw sugar into his cup, which he freshened with a small pot of steeping catnip. Gwen eyeballed it, contemplating drinking catnip. That always looks better than it tastes, I bet, she speculated. You should try same, he suggested. She grinned. No thanks. Contempt prior to investigation, he rebutted. Again, that's a little too heavy-handed for you. Something is stuck in your craw to be sure, she said, scanning her texts. No mention of dinner from her grandmother. She made a noise, sounding like Mrs. Donaldson. It was not lost on Emmy, as nothing was, as he cocked his brow at her. It felt like he was going to open up about his uncharacteristic mood. He slid in next to her on the wall bench when the welcome committee erupted. They were on their feet, glued to the sights on Perryville Foothills. Oh, my word! Mrs. Dawson called out. Gwen and Emmy turned to look. A truck had taken a spill as it turned, as the others before it had. There's been a crash, Mrs. Donaldson announced the obvious. Then, with no explanation, the truck righted itself and kept on going. What do you make of that? Asked Miss Donaldson to the other members of the welcoming committee. My cousin Derek showing off, lamented Emmy. Chapter 2. Are you going to spill the beans? Asked Gwen finally, holding Emmy's feet to the fire. No pun intended, he returned. Come on, she said. What's the story? Shall I invite the gaggle over here? He asked acidly. Gwen stared at him with a scowl. He released a heavy sigh and relented. It's just that they're listening to our every word, he told her, slipping in one more argument. Emmy, Gwen replied with warning. Oh, all right. As we are both aware, he began, his mid-Atlantic accent heavier than usual, there have been a great deal of changes in our lives, mine in particular, going from a four-legged creature with 9 lives to a bipedal with 1 life. Me losing my beloved companion, Gwen added sentimentally. Emmy covered her hand with his. You haven't lost me, he assured her. About the change, word traveled fast as only word does in this town, and Derek decided now was the time to restore the glory that was once Brightston Mansion. "I sense that this is the root of your distress? Which is it, Derek or the mansion?" she asked. "By rights, that estate is partially mine," Emmy replied. "So it's the house," clarified Gwen. His head whipped around and he cut his eyes to her. "It's not a house," he corrected. Okay, she chuckled. "It's not the house," he said. "I have a grand place on the hill, which any of us would love to be. The hill is the place to live," said Gwen. "You and Kevin are probably the only people outside of myself who feel the exact opposite," he remarked. "It's not the house so much as Derek's smugness." "That's what has you upset? That your cousin has a personality quirk?" she challenged. She regarded him until he rolled his eyes. "It sounds so silly when I actually say it out loud," he said. "But he's tall, blonde, handsome, and so sure of himself. As we were coming up, he always had to do one better than me. Maybe you don't get that because you and your grandmother have a strong and healthy relationship, but it's a tough thing to contend with." "Okay," she said. "I can see anxiety, and I know it's for real." "Just you watch," he laughed nervously. "He's going to come out of the Perryville Foothills and ingratiate himself on everything that's mine." "Take it easy," she counseled. "What could he possibly take of yours?" "My town, my life," he fired off. Gwen's brows knitted with confusion. "Emmy," she said, trying to reel him back in. "I haven't said this since the spell was lifted from me," he began. "But you and Grandma Robbie are my family." "And you're ours," she promised. They sandwiched their hands in a stack on the table. "What's going on here?" asked Mrs. Donaldson. "Looks like a séance." Gwen looked down at their hands and silently conceded that the woman was correct. But she and Emmy recoiled as though the surface they had touched was suddenly very hot. "The ladies and I have been talking," she began. "You don't say," Emmy retorted, reverting to the sour tone. "And we would seriously like it if you kindly introduced us to your cousin," she said. "So you've already said," replied Emmy. "It would mean a lot to us as the welcoming committee. We haven't put on a party in quite some time and, well, we're very excited," she said. "You see where those trucks went?" He pointed to the window at nearly the precise spot where the trucks turned into the tree line. "Yes," she said. "That's where you go," he said. "Then knock on the door." "Really?" she gasped with disappointment. "It would better suit those of us of a certain age if he were to meet us here, for example. It might be a bit too rough terrain for us if he is indeed renovating the mansion as you say he is, as the line of trucks clearly indicate he is." "I'll see what I can do," he replied with a slight, forced bow. As Mrs. Donaldson returned to her group, he added, "Nosy old Wiccan." "Emmy," Gwen scolded, "are you sure you're not possessed? Perhaps we should go see Grandma Robbie." "I feel as though I'm cursed again," he answered mournfully. "I will lose everything." "No, you won't," she said. "Listen, Grandma Robbie is having Kevin over for dinner tonight. Join us. I don't think you've been by as our guest since you moved out." "Guest?" he rasped as though she had called him a bad name. "See, it's happening already." She laughed softly. "You are as nervous as a—" She stopped short as her eyes spread in horror as the simile she was about to say. "A cat?" He arched his brow. "It's no secret I used to be a cat." "It's a secret to everyone but Grandma Robbie, Kevin, and me. We'll leave that to you to share as you are comfortable. You have nothing to worry about where we are concerned. You are our family, and if I moved away from Grandma Robbie and returned for a visit, I would be a guest. I really am just asking you to come to dinner. We would love to have you." Emmy dabbed his eyes with the corner of his napkin. "Very well," he said. "And you can tell us all about Brightston Mansion and share your apprehension about Derek. For corn's sake, where has he been all this time?" she asked. And the moment the question passed her lips, she knew it was kind of silly. This was the town of Green, where magical people and paranormals lived, more or less harmoniously. It was nothing for a being to rise out of dormancy like a cicada and come to life. "Well, yeah," she said. "Save it for dinner." "I would rather communicate with your newest offspring, Dandelion," he offered. "Divinity," she corrected. Again. Perhaps it was out of his insecurity of being replaced that he couldn't get the kitten's name right. It had to be. He was much more astute than that. "And what was the other one's name?" he asked dully. "Blue," she said. "Divinity and Blue. And may I remind you, somewhere way back before we got the cats, it was your idea to go to the rescue to home new creatures." "Oh, whatever," he replied, belabored. He rose from the table, clearing his cup of tea and small teapot to the bin above the trash can. "So, I'll tell Gram one more for dinner?" she asked brightly. "Yes," he replied warily. "Only if you want," she assured him. "Consider it an open invitation. If you feel up to it, come. If not, don't." Emmy sniffled. "I'll come," he said. "I think I'll ask Roberta if there is room for some of my bread pudding. I made a batch last night." "Delightful!" And with that, he departed. Quin reflected on the circumstances under which he was put under a spell, and it was a little hard to imagine. According to his version of the story, he wounded the ego of a well-placed lady of society who was jealous of the attention he paid to other women. It was difficult to envision a bread-pudding-baking, crystal-embedded, shoe-ornament-sporting, sensitive gentleman being the object of desire for the women of the town. In any era. Unless he did it for a living, it didn't seem plausible that a man in his day would have baked bread pudding. But, oh well, she looked forward to it since she knew it would be delicious. She packed her things up and climbed aboard her bicycle. In the past, Emmy in a basket would be transported on Gwen's bicycle. Now, it was her laptop and phone. She didn't bother with her purse since she was only blocks away from home, and really, there was no need to carry it around. She had not pedaled but a few turns when she had to stop short or else be rammed through by a speeding car. The vehicle pulled over to the side, and the driver glided over to her. He didn't run. He didn't walk fast. He floated inches above the street and smoothly approached. Magic, thought Gwen. "My dear lady," the older gentleman began, "are you quite well?" "I'm fine," she said, a little shaken. "May I escort you across the street?" he offered. "You know, that might be kind of nice," she said, strangely acquiescing. This was a stranger, after all, and though most citizens in the town of Green were benign with little exception, it was kind of weird. But to cross the street took seconds, and after that, Gwen was done with the man. He was tall and overly dressed for a casual spring day. His body was remarkably solid. She knew this simply as his forearm braced the small of her back. "Thank you," she said, nodding slightly. He bowed as if to say, "At your service," and returned to the other side of the street. Gwen walked her bike the rest of the way home, mildly entranced. She wheeled her bicycle around the back of the house and onto the screen porch, where she parked it for the evening. She entered the house through the kitchen door. "What's with you?" asked Grandma Robbie. That was strange. Gwen recalled asking Emmy the same question. She touched her face lightly. "Do I look funny?" she asked. "You look like you just met the man you will marry," replied Grandma Robbie, studiously stirring something in a saucepan. "I invited Emmy for dinner," said Gwen listlessly. "I hope that's okay." "That's fine," she said. "I'm starting it now. I thought we would try some of that cauliflower rice. I'm making mushroom risotto and meatballs." "That sounds wonderful," Gwen replied dreamily. "Okay, that's it," said Grandma Robbie, abandoning her wooden spoon. "Let me feel your forehead." She reached for Gwen, touching her forehead first with the back of her hand and then with her palm. "What did you have to eat, and who did you see?" she demanded firmly. "I just came from working at Gunderson's," said Gwen. "Let me set my laptop down and I'll help you." "You sit right down and have some lavender tea," ordered Grandma Robbie. That sounded plain awful, though Gwen adored lavender. She washed her hair with it. She used a face and body cream that her grandmother mixed up that was loaded with it. She adored lavender tea after a shower, with her hair wrapped up and her body wrapped in a thick terry. But for some reason, she was repelled by the very idea. "No, thank you," she insisted. "Gwen Paris," Grandma Robbie called her out. "I repeat, who have you encountered?" It was odd. Gwen could not answer the question. Gwen blinked. Divinity the kitten leaped into her lap as Blue ambled slowly in and sat quietly. "I saw Kevin, of course," she began. "I saw Emmy, who was in a heck of a mood. Mrs. Donaldson and her welcoming committee were there. I saw Jolene." Grandma Robbie cut her off. "Jolene? Who is that?" "That's Kevin's new counter girl." "Nice enough," said Gwen. "Not overly impressive." Grandma Robbie studied her, trying to formulate a diagnosis. "Oh, and there was this gentleman," said Gwen, as though it was the furthest thing from her mind. The truth was, her entire being had lingering effects of her encounter with him. It was such a random, quick moment, but now that she reflected, he made an incredible impression on her. It was like he got into her aura or something. "Gentleman?" inquired Grandma Robbie. "What kind of gentleman?" "The gentlemanly kind," she replied. "Okay, I am not liking your dopey answers," Grandma Robbie decided. "Sit still at the table, please." Now that Grandma Robbie mentioned it, Gwen felt awfully strange. She did as she was told and sat still for her grandmother, who raked her fingers through the air around her. It felt like she was brushing out tangles. Grandma Robbie tugged and Gwen leaned. It actually hurt as she pulled. "Ouch!" Gwen complained. "Hold still," said Grandma Robbie. "I'm trying to be as gentle as I can." "What is it?" asked Gwen. "Snarls," replied Grandma Robbie. "What the heck?" But the more her grandmother tended to her, the clearer-headed Gwen became until she felt grounded and whole. "What the heck indeed," said Grandma Robbie. "That was no gentleman." "Oh, pshaw, Gram," she replied. "Pshaw! What century are we in?" Grandma Robbie demanded, her hands resting on her hips. "Did I say pshaw?" blinked Gwen. "I am not sure exactly what that even means." "You used it correctly in a sentence, if the sentence was nearly 200 years old," Grandma Robbie replied, as she stared Gwen down. "What?" asked Gwen innocently. "How many times have I told you not to talk to strangers?" she lectured. I am not a child, and technically the first words you speak to a person the first time you meet them is talking to a stranger, Gwen quipped. Be a smarty pants all you want, missy, her grandmother replied. That gentleman sullied your aura. You walked through the door, all loopy. It's a wonder you made it home and weren't whisked away to his lair. Oh, for corn's sake, exclaimed Gwen. Divinity climbed as high as he could, tapping Gwen's chin to get her attention. Gram, you notice this kitten stays a kitten? She asked. He's not getting any bigger. Meanwhile, Blue waited patiently. Grandma Robbie, who returned to her cooking, drew down a bowl and retrieved a parchment paper from the fridge. She flaked off a fish fillet into the bowl and spilled a little warm water over it. She stirred it and felt it to test the temperature. Gwen knew this because she did this a gazillion times. The cats were getting fish. Here you go, dear Blue, she said. Divinity was not interested in the least. He was now staring Gwen in the eye. She could swear he was trying to tell her something. She felt awful, though. Despite the feeling that the kitten was trying to connect, she wasn't as interested as she had been in Emmy. It takes time, dear, said Grandma Robbie, reading her mind. Dinner will be in an hour, but I expect our guests will be here sooner. Go wash up. Gwen set the kitten down but maintained eye contact with it all the way as she placed it on the floor. As though it hadn't already, she had a distinct feeling that something strange was about to happen. Chapter 3. Gwen managed to take a quick cat nap before dinner. She sank into a deep, scrumptious sleep and woke as though she had slept the night away, but only 20 minutes had passed. She ran a brush through her hair. For a flicker of a second, as she regarded herself in the mirror, she saw herself in a silk dress with a whalebone bodice and a full skirt. The sides of her hair were swept up, and the top of her head was adorned with a tiny hat that matched her dress. She brushed a cascading lone curl with a silver, soft-bristled brush. But that was a small wrinkle of truth that blipped before her and was gone. Gwen was back to her usual self, dressed in a soft, faded t-shirt of pale peach and a pair of jeans she liked to roll up at the cuffs. She had fallen asleep with the windows ajar, and now that it was approaching evening, the air had cooled considerably. She slipped on an embroidered cardigan of a deeper peach. She emerged from her bedroom to note that Grandma Robbie, too, had stolen a few minutes for rest. That left just Gwen, Divinity, and Blue, and it was like they were waiting for her. She sat on the couch and awaited their approach. "Well, come on," she said softly. Divinity leaped and made it as far as the side of the couch to which he clung like a tree frog until he collected his bearings. He climbed the rest of the way up to her. Gwen sucked in her breath as she heard his little claws clipping the fabric of the couch. She could not remember if Emmy as a cat had ever done damage to the furniture. She prayed that Divinity had not wrecked Grandma Robbie's heirloom sofa. Divinity sat on Gwen's thighs, studying her. He approached hesitantly, softly stepping up her chest until his tiny, almost all-white face with a splotch of marbled gray over his left eye was but a breath from hers. Whether there was something goofy about him, as Emmy insinuated, he was awfully cute. It wasn't his fault that Gwen had to warm up to him. Surely he sensed her reluctance. She was glad she rescued him, but she had not allowed herself that adjustment period in between pets. She had some catching up to do. At the same time Gwen and Grandma Robbie adopted Blue and Divinity, the entire shelter was emptied. Someone rescued all of the residents. No one knew who or how that happened. Gwen thought Kevin was behind it, but he assured her he was not. And of course, it quickly filled back up. But for a moment, there was a little more peace in the town of Green. Quin touched his little back with a finger and stroked him. He craned and arched in full cat mode. His little face drew up in the sweetest smile as he purred like a motorboat. Her heart could not help but soften toward him. A lot. She lifted him up to her cheek like a downy chick. "Okay," she relented. "You're really cute. Shall we be pals?" Grandma Robbie tottered out of her bedroom. She looked weary even though she had just napped. It was clear to Gwen that perhaps she was leaving too many domestic chores for the older woman to do. There was nothing like the comfort of having someone make a home for her, but Gwen admittedly had been lax. "I'll get dinner on," said Gwen. "You sit here and wait for Kevin and Emmy." Another purr, this time from outside, whirred down the street. It had the sound of both a lawnmower and a chainsaw, but it was neither. Gwen peeked out the front window. It was Kevin and Emmy arriving for dinner in a motorcycle with a sidecar. "What the heck?" exclaimed Gwen. Grandma Robbie looked for herself. A deep, guttural laugh rolled out of her chest. Both men sported goggles that made them look like wasps. Kevin drove while Emmy rode shotgun. They were completely amused with themselves as they approached the front door, their hair disheveled and windblown. Grandma Robbie greeted them. "Gentlemen," she said with a smile in her voice. "Come on in." Gwen set the table. "Sorry, fellas," she called to them from the dining area. "I'm a little behind. Whose new toy?" "Ours," they chorused. So, Kevin inherited a house and let Emmy live there, and now they shared a motorcycle. It was a strange and fast friendship the two shared, and it had Gwen thinking. She nodded as she squinted at the two of them. "What?" asked Kevin. "I think we need to wash up," said Emmy in his usual fastidious manner. "Be right there," said Kevin, joining Emmy. Gwen blinked at Grandma Robbie with complete perplexity. Grandma Robbie shrugged. "They're friends," she pronounced casually. Gwen was a little jealous, and it smarted to even admit that to herself. Had Emmy surpassed her spot on Kevin's bud list? So quickly, the two of them had a closer relationship than she and Kevin did, and that sort of drove it home that any daydreams about Kevin Pearson getting romantic with her should be put to rest. She scooped up Divinity, who waited at her feet. "Come on, Divinity," she murmured. "You love me." "Gwendolyn," Grandma Robbie scolded lightly. "That's the problem with having intuitives in the house. No privacy," she remarked with levity. "That's right," Grandma Robbie replied with a smile. Emmy and Kevin appeared just in time to hold the chairs for the two women. "Thank you," Grandma Robbie said graciously. "Smells good, Gram," said Kevin. Again, Gwen squinted at him. She wasn't mistaken. That was a new thing. "Did Gwen tell you about the hubbub this afternoon?" asked Kevin, digging in. "About the man helping her cross the street?" asked Grandma Robbie. "No," replied Kevin teasingly. "I did not know a man helped Gwen across the street." Gwen was annoyed. "It doesn't bother you that a guy stopped to help me walk safely across the main road?" she challenged. Kevin shrugged. "Should it?" he asked. "Oh no," said Gwen. "Except that apparently he gave me tangles." Emmy sat up straighter. "What did he look like?" he asked intently. "I'm interested in knowing about the hubbub," said Grandma Robbie. "I think the stories are related," offered Emmy. "About this man." "How are they related?" Gwen asked. "He came around the corner kind of like he just learned how to drive and stopped short of running me over. He walked me across the street as a sort of amends." "Now your turn," said Grandma Robbie to Kevin. "A bunch of trucks hauling up Perryville Foothills to what we all decided was Brightston Mansion was none other than Amulet Payne's family home," said Kevin. Is that why you decided to buy a motorcycle with him? Ribbed Gwen. Gwenny, warned Grandma Robbie telepathically. So, how do you think the rehabbing of Brightston Mansion is related to a guy almost running me over? Asked Gwen. Was this man about my height? Asked Emmy. Distinguished looking and very charming. Yes, said Gwen. But that could be anyone in this town. That could be you. Close, said Emmy. I believe it was my cousin Derek. And how do you come up with that? She chuckled. Just a feeling, replied Emmy. And every one of us here knows that feelings mean something. Yeah, said Gwen. Too bad Mrs. Donaldson didn't run into him. She's begging Emmy to let the welcoming committee welcome him. That's because the welcoming committee hasn't never had anyone to welcome, laughed Grandma Robbie. The table joined her. It was a silly notion that such a small town had dozens of these little committees and clubs, far too formal and organized for the otherwise simple community. Divinity sat on Gwen's lap. Oh no, Emmy shook his head. Bad manners. We're still bonding, said Gwen. Rather awkwardly. I'll let him sit for a minute and then let him down. Blue curled up in her basket. She was the epitome of quiet. Her blue fur had faint purple stripes when the waning daylight hit it. So, you don't like Mrs. Donaldson? Gwen asked Grandma Robbie. I don't like nor dislike her. She's not a bad sort, replied the older woman. It seems like you know everyone, but you're not a part of any of these committees, said Gwen. And yet, I get involved, she chuckled. Yes, you do, laughed Kevin. So do I, for that matter. Well, you own one of the most respected establishments in town. You serve many needs of our community, Emmy gushed. Okay, said Gwen, setting her fork down and lowering the kitten to the ground. This brofest is over the top. What? Asked Emmy, staring at her. So, is your cousin moving to town, or is he here to oversee the project? Asked Grandma Robbie. He's here to stay, Emmy said reluctantly. Why don't you like him? Asked Gwen, dabbing her lips with a cloth napkin. I don't dislike him, said Emmy. Not entirely. I just don't want him around. But why? Reiterated Gwen. Because he tends to ingratiate himself on the fairer sex, he replied. Translation? He likes the ladies, laughed Gwen. Well, he does, Emmy concurred. And it's not always benign. You had a brief encounter with him. Did he leave you feeling a little strange? Gwen's eyes narrowed. What do you know about that? She asked. I had to currycomb her aura, replied Grandma Robbie. He errs on the dastardly side, said Emmy. This is not back then when we were young rakes. We live in different times. Well, even back then, being a young rake could get you cursed, barbed Gwen. She realized immediately she crossed over a line. The subject of Emmy's being turned into a cat because he chased the ladies was a sore one. Sorry, said Gwen. I was only kidding. Well, you can see that sensitivity over the relationships between people who share an attraction is a timeless issue. The problem with my cousin is that his charm is supernatural, not natural. Meaning? Asked Gwen. He's a warlock, answered Grandma Robbie in a heavy voice. Gwen's eyes flared. Goodness, she uttered. That sounds ominous. No more than my being a gentle witch is, replied Grandma Robbie. But, yes, it can be. Everyone made a pretty good dent in their meals. Kevin pushed his plate in reflexively to indicate he was done. Emmy did the same. How about tea? Asked Emmy. I'll make it, Roberta. You three go relax in the living room. "Oh, you don't have to do that," said Grandma Robbie. "All those cans of wet food and bowls of kitty cereal," he said. "I can never extend my thanks. This is the least I can do." Divinity meowed. He was now at Ammy's feet and staring up at him. Quin watched as Emmy softened. "Oh, all right," he relented and lifted the fluff ball. "Come along." Blue mewed. "You too, old girl," he said. Grandma Robbie and Kevin sat on opposite ends of the sofa while Gwen curled up in Queen Anne's chair. It was pretty comfortable, but, to be polite, she relocated to a smaller, mid-century chair and left the other for Emmy. "Do you really think the guy who helped me could have been Derek?" asked Gwen. "Seems odd that he has all these trucks coming to his place, and he comes into town." "I can only speculate," said Grandma Robbie. "Did he look at all like Emmy?" "Yeah," said Gwen. "Come to think of it, he did. He was like a magnet." Grandma Robbie nodded. "Yep, the better to entrance you with, my dear," she said. Emmy entered the living room with a tray set with a pot of hot water and 4 cups. Gwen knew that Kevin was not much of a tea drinker, and so it plucked her jealousy streak somewhat that he was making a concession for Emmy. "What kind of tea are we drinking?" asked Gwen. "Catnip, of course," he announced with delight. "I have some to spare for the kitties." Divinity and Blue were at his heels. He stooped and deposited 2 small satchels, one for each of them. They sniffed and rolled, and then finally toyed with them. "They like it," said Emmy. Divinity looked doped. "He's stoned," Gwen noted. "He's happy," Emmy amended. "So, back to your cousin," said Grandma Robbie. "If you won't let us have him over for dinner, will you let the ladies throw a party for him?" "I suppose," said Emmy. "He's going to make his presence known sooner or later. He already has. You better keep an eye on that aura, Missy." "Lesson learned," she smiled. "I won't let him near me again." "Famous last words," said Emmy. "It's not like I'm a married woman or even a dating woman," said Gwen, hoping to get a little rise out of Kevin. The only attention she got was from Divinity, who hopped onto her lap with the satchel in his mouth. "Oh my word," she said. "How adorable." He dropped it and waited. "He wants you to throw it," said Emmy. "You know this?" She arched her brow. Gwen took a gamble and chucked it. Off the kitten flew to fetch it. He brought it back. She did it again and again. He brought it back. "He's a puppy," she laughed. "I suppose then I could tell Kathy and Donaldson that they can start planning," continued Grandma Robbie. Gwen cocked her head. "You sound like you want to join that committee after all," said Gwen. "She wants to meet Derek," Emmy said wanly. "We'd better check your aura to make sure you haven't any tangles." Blue rolled endlessly on her satchel and regarded the people with a look of intoxication. "That is exactly how Gwen looked when she came home," noted Grandma Robbie. Kevin finally registered concern. He said. "Perhaps I should go meet this man myself." "I'll introduce you tomorrow," said Emmy. Gwen shook her head with disbelief. "So, that's the way to your heart," she said to Emmy. "Have Kevin ask. Poor Mrs. Donaldson was practically standing on her head for a yes from you, but Kevin pipes up?" "It's a little different, Gwen," Kevin defended. "Why, of course it is," she said, and sipped her tea. Delicious." She was fibbing. The tea was dreadful, but it did have a delightful effect. She felt her reality pleasantly bending, and slowly, by degrees, she was mellowing. That was the last of her sarcasm for the evening. Almost. Chapter 4. As was her habit, Gwen checked the sky on awakening. It was a brilliant blue, which meant, she guessed, that the air was clear and fresh, practically void of humidity. She washed and dressed quickly, donning a pair of jean cutoffs and a gingham shirt. She slipped on her tennis shoes and walked to the kitchen with the purpose of asking Grandma Robbie for a walk. Her grandmother was reading the paper. As far as Gwen could tell, her grandmother was one of the last people she knew who read an actual paper. Divinity in Blue found Gwen's feet and sat at them. "Good morning, crew," she said. It was strange that, at first, Kevin thought Blue was a little off the mark, but as far as she could tell, she was solid and grounded. She was an older cat. The vet guesstimated that she was in her tweens. Divinity mewed, and when Blue saw that Gwen picked him up, she mewed too. It was the first sound she made since arriving. Grandma Robbie folded down the corner of her paper. "Was that our girl?" she asked. "It was," Gwen beamed. She was flooded with adoration for the older cat in a way most experienced towards kittens. "I think I am falling in love with my crew," said Gwen. Grandma Robbie laughed one of her deep, slow laughs. "Better not let Emmy hear you say that," she warned, clicking her nails to entice Blue. The older cat took her cue and trotted over. Grandma Robbie patted the sofa, and Blue accepted the invitation. "How cute," said Gwen. Divinity hopped to her shoulder and literally got in Gwen's face. She was purring loudly for one so small and regarded Gwen with wide eyes. "Oh, you couldn't be jealous, could you?" she asked the kitten. She touched her nose to his and set him on her lap. "So, Kevin got an invitation to the mansion, but we didn't," Gwen began. "Did you say something about jealousy, dear?" asked Grandma Robbie. "Not moi," said Gwen. "Oh, no," she said. "Want to take a walk?" she asked, changing the subject. "I do," said Grandma Robbie, taking in a deep breath and releasing. "But I have a feeling so do these two adorables. How to solve that? I can't possibly carry Blue around in a basket." Gwen snapped her fingers. "Got it," she announced. She set the kitten next to Blue and darted through the kitchen, down the stairs to the cellar. There was a wagon of her childhood. She tugged it a little to test its working order before hiking up the steps with it. "Ta-da!" she sang. "I will line the base here comfortably and volunteer to pull her." "What about the squirt here?" asked Grandma Robbie. "You can't tote a basket and pull the wagon." Gwen was inspired. "I think if I fashion a special little nest for him, he will stay. Shall we give it a try?" she asked. "I have the perfect pillow for them," said Grandma Robbie, abandoning her paper altogether. Gwen wiped the wagon down with a tea-cloth, prepping it for the lining. Grandma Robbie drew out a striped pillow from the linen closet that could not fit better into the wagon than if it were custom-made. As if they were commanded, Blue and Divinity broke from the sofa to inspect the pillow-lined wagon. "Wait a minute," Grandma Robbie gently counseled, and she coiled her soft knit scarf around, creating enough of an opening for Divinity to cuddle in. He knew what to do, as did Blue. They assumed their spots and settled down into them. "Perfect," Gwen proclaimed. "Let's give this a whirl," said Grandma Robbie. Gwen lifted the wagon down the front steps as the cats trustingly stayed put. Blue's eyes bugged a little bit when the wagon actually started rolling, but she adjusted. The idea was a success. Blue and Divinity could now accompany Gwen and her grandmother, not just on walks, but anywhere. But it seemed that Gwen and Grandma Robbie had different walking routes in mind. As their feet touched the pavement, Grandma Robbie headed up the hill, and Gwen started down. "What?" asked her grandmother. "We always go this way." "We do," agreed Gwen. "I thought we could grab a coffee." "I don't think they're visiting at this hour. We have time to get a real walk-in and still wind up at Gunderson's in time for you to impose yourself on their little trip." "I am not imposing," she said. "Not exactly." Grandma Robbie waited. "Not really. And besides, why can't I ask if I can go?" she protested. "You can," said Grandma Robbie. "And being direct and honest is one of the most effective spells of all." Their neighborhood stroll took them past Emmy's house, which was really a house that Kevin inherited but didn't really want or need. It was a handsome structure in the most coveted neighborhood in the town of Green. Known as the Hill, high-end, long-standing homes plotted on the hill, with the ones approaching the apex the most prestigious. People did strange things to get a street address on the hill. Pretty much someone had to die before a newcomer could move in, which was Kevin's case. A dear friend bequeathed him the home right when Emmy was looking for one. A team of landscapers worked busily on the yard. "Looks like he's having some work done, just like his cousin," noted Gwen. "Yep," her grandmother replied non-committally. "Don't you think that's a sign of competition?" asked Gwen. "What's it to you?" she chuckled. "But if you want my opinion, he's not the competitive one." The two women navigated up and then down the hill, crossing through the main thoroughfare to the corner where Gunderson sat, for decades now. It was a filling station, a garage, a coffee shop, a donut shop, and an all-around eatery. Even with quaint shops and other sweet cafes in the town of Green, Gunderson's was the hottest spot around. As they approached the entrance, Grandma Robbie stopped. "They aren't going to let us in there with a wagon," she said. "Sure they will," said Gwen. "I don't think so," countered Grandma Robbie. "At least, I don't think we should." Kevin pushed through the office door to the garage side with a big smile on his face. "Well, hello there," he said. "Are we on an outing?" "Yes," said Gwen. "We came up this way to include our entire household on a walk, and it worked." "I see," said Kevin, clearly taken with the cats. "Would they like to come in for a couple of cappuccinos? I think we might even have some snippets of salmon left over that we can't sell." He held the door open for them. His timing was incredible, and that he resolved their question was also a pause for thought. It was like he knew, and that warmed Gwen's heart. He took the handle from her hand and led the cats into the eatery. The man who had helped Gwen cross the street appeared in the doorway. "My lady, we meet again," he said. "And who is this enchantress with you? Allow me." And with that, he offered his arm to Grandma Robbie, escorting her to the table where Kevin parked the cats. Kevin fired a look over to Gwen, whose eyes were flared with amazement. "What the heck?" she intuited to him. He smiled and nodded. "I know," he replied, with a big grin on his face. "2 cappuccinos coming up," he announced, and swept Divinity up in his giant bear paw. "You, little guy, we'll have to feed with a dropper or something. The cappuccinos are bigger than you are." It was something to witness such a giant, beefy man, masculine in all ways, talk baby talk to a kitten, and then to see him be so sensitive as to include Blue. "And you too, Missy Cat. We will have a special bowl just for you," he said. It took Gwen a moment to notice that Emmy was present. She felt him before she saw him. He disapproved of everything from their being there to Kevin's oohing and awing over the cats. Gwen looked up in time to see him roll his eyes. He was suffering in the presence of his cousin, who fawned over Grandma Robbie a little too much. Gwen cleared her throat to get her grandmother's attention. "Ahem," she said. Grandma Robbie looked over her way with a dopey expression that matched how she felt the day before when this mysterious and sudden town arrival put tangles in her aura. As if there was not enough commotion, Mrs. Donaldson glided through the door, smiles from ear to ear as though her appearance was just some kind of coincidence. "Roberta," began Mrs. Donaldson, "what brings you here?" "My 2 feet," replied Grandma Robbie. That's her wacky weed voice, thought Gwen. Her grandmother was definitely enchanted by the gentleman. "Emmy," began Gwen graciously, "I believe introductions are in order?" Emmy groaned audibly. "Derek Payne, Roberta and Gwen Paris," he rifled off in monotone. "Roberta, Gwen, I give you my cousin, Derek Payne." Derek took Grandma Robbie's hand with a flourish and bowed to her. His eyes met Gwen's, and though he did not touch her at all, he vibed her. The effect was equal to inoculation. He wasn't in any way her type, if she had one. Plus, she was attracted to Kevin, tall, virile, and yet sensitive. Derek was dashing, but, in reality, too old. Though as their eyes met, a whir of energy pushed through her and left her completely and totally amorous. "Good night, nurse," she murmured. "Ahem!" Mrs. Donaldson now cleared her throat. "What is this? Is there some sort of virus going around with everyone coughing?" complained Emmy. Kevin set the cappuccino down before Blue, who very sweetly accepted it. He returned divinity to his little nest, but not before showing his whipped cream-spiked chin whiskers. Kevin quickly retracted the kitten after taking one look at Gwen. "What?" she asked, barely able to respond. For whatever reason, Derek had put her in a pleasant mood. She was unflappable. "Hello?" Kevin asked. "Kathy Ann Donaldson." Mrs. Donaldson extended her hand, tired of waiting for anyone else to introduce her. "Derek Payne." Derek accepted her hand and bowed. Mrs. Donaldson giggled endlessly. Emmy had had it. "Shall we go, Derek?" asked Emmy. "Kevin, is this a good time?" Mrs. Donaldson snapped out of it enough to body block Derek. "Mr. Payne, on behalf of the welcoming committee of the town of Green, I would like to welcome you to our fair town by way of a party. We want you to be a guest of honor," she said, and handed him a card. "Why, thank you, my dear lady," he said, laying on the charm. She touched her chest and breathed deeply. Gwen wondered if he was enchanting all the women there. "Are you going to the house?" asked Gwen to Kevin casually. "We are," he said. "You can join us if you like, except you have the critters." "Surely you can fit them in your carriage?" Derek asked of Kevin. He smiled politely. "I don't think so. If you want to head home, we can swing by in a few minutes to pick you up." "Yes," said Grandma Robbie distantly. "I need the fresh air." There was a trace of a smile on her face. Derek walked her to the door like he was courting her in days of old. Though he was clearly focused on her grandmother, Derek attracted other females like flies. Even Jolene drifted from behind the counter and trailed them as Gwen, the wagon, and her grandmother exited Gunderson's very soon after they arrived. "Well, I guess this was what folks call a meet and greet," gushed Grandma Robbie. "Charming. Simply charming," Derek remarked. "Yes, well, goodbye, both of you," Emmy said bluntly, and then under his breath he began to say, "Don't let the door hit you where—" "Amulet," scolded Gwen, cutting him off before he could finish the saying. "My goodness!" It was a little work to make it to the sidewalk, but Gwen noted that the more distance she and her grandmother put between Derek, the clear-headed she became. Grandma Robbie's expression sobered up. They trudged in silence back home. And though the cats were very cooperative in their first ride out, Gwen wondered if it had not been a little much for them. "Come on, sweeties," she said. "Let's get you some water." "Thanks," Gwen distinctly heard. Her eyes flew open, for this was déjà vu. This was exactly how it began with Emmy. First, she heard his thoughts, and then he outright spoke to her. Shortly after that, through dramatic circumstances, his spell was reversed, and it was revealed he was actually a human, not a cat. One of the cats had communicated, but she could not tell which. She looked over to Grandma Robbie, who was zoned out on the sofa. "Did you hear that?" she asked urgently. "Hear what, dear?" asked her grandmother listlessly. "Is that Derek a nice man?" "Yes," said Quin, now fetching water for Grandma Robbie. "He seemed to pay attention to you, and that was nice." "I think he pays attention to the ladies, but yes, it was nice," she answered, looking up at the ceiling, so very much in a daydream. "It has been a long time since a fellow made my head spin. I think I have the munchies." "Grandma Robbie," scolded Gwen, "where did you hear something like that?" "It's not my first day, dear," she giggled. "I knew something like that before you did." She lifted the older woman's feet up on the couch and drew the crocheted blanket over her. "You need a nap, I think," said Gwen. Kevin's horn sounded out front. "I shouldn't be long," said Gwen. "Blue, Divinity, take care of Gram for me." Once again, she heard an unmistakable response that came from no human. "Okay," it said. Gwen stopped short in the doorway, like she was about to run into something. The fact that she heard thoughts or that she received communications this way should not have shaken her, but there was something about it. It meant that somehow, and probably soon, something was going to happen. Kevin honked his horn again. Gwen bounded down the lawn to him. Derek and Emmy were in the back seat. They had saved the front passenger seat for her. All three men scrambled to get her door, but Kevin won out. It was just something she sensed, but it was almost like it was really important to him that he, and not Derek, be the one to act a gentleman toward her. Chapter 5. Kevin's car dipped a little too fast down to the bottom of the hill, only to glide to the base of the rest of the Perryville Foothills. The drop made Gwen's stomach lurch like she was on a roller coaster. "Wow," she uttered. Otherwise, the car was quiet, uncomfortably so. The discomfort, in part, was because Gwen was the only woman there. She felt an intense focus on her coming from the back seat. She worked the nerve up to raise her eyes to the rear view. Emmy was looking out the window, but Derek was staring right through her, and he filled the reflection like he was haunting it. Despite the presence of the other men, it was like Gwen and Derek were the only two there. He was brazen in his attention, even when it was totally silent. She regretted getting herself invited to see his home. The trip was quick, but it was remarkable how in the short distance the world changed. It went from the long-established little town of Green immediately into the rural, rugged wilderness of ancient old-growth forest and a rudimentary two-lane road. The travel up into the Perryville Foothills had not become much more civilized than when the road was cut hundreds of years before. When Kevin took the turn down the long, winding drive that led to Brightston Mansion, Gwen experienced a second lurch, not from a drop, but from traversing an invisible field, like a time warp. The trees through which the mansion peaked thinned. They seemed to grow younger. They bore a newness that they didn't have when the wheels of the car first hit drive. The signs of construction evaporated, and the huge cargo trucks were neatly tucked away and out of sight. Kevin's car came to a stop. Its doors opened opposite to each other like in a carriage. And this time, when Derek offered his hand, the gesture didn't seem painfully out of time. To the contrary, its effect was, without a doubt, an aphrodisiac. Kevin and Emmy exited the car. They were aloof, not the least bit interested in her. Kevin's long hair was longer now. It hit the middle of his back. Emmy seemed more robust, less frail. His hair was browner with just a touch of frost. But Derek had also revitalized. He looked like a slightly older, way better-looking version of his cousin, but years younger than the man she met at Gunderson's. The allure that was suggested in that geriatric face back in town was alive and fully reconstituted. Gwen experienced the full measure of his charisma. It was almost impossible to withstand now that Derek was a younger, more attractive man. Derek offered his arm, and she took it. Kevin and Emmy trailed them like footmen. As they climbed the stairs to the front door, it opened. They were greeted by a servant. The house was splendid, with high ceilings and polished floors. They walked the middle level, admiring the view. The visit was to be fairly fast because Kevin had to get back. Gwen absorbed things through impressions since she couldn't really hear conversations. She was led along, and somehow while Kevin and Emmy had been behind Derek and her, as they approached the front door, they were now in front of them. "Please stay with me," Derek beckoned her. Gwen wanted to with an unearthly desire, but a stronger force compelled her forward, and she climbed into Kevin's car, getting her own door and quickly closing herself in. She stared at Derek, who stayed behind at the doorway, the old man that he had been before. It was an old house again. Kevin and Emmy were themselves again, completely unaware. But as Gwen returned Derek's gaze, it was clear to her he knew exactly what she had experienced. Kevin dropped Gwen off at her house. She ran right into her bathroom and took a shower. It was the only thing she knew to get her head right after that strange experience. Her grandmother was fast asleep in a midday nap. Gwen fired up the laptop to get to work. While she was waiting for her screen to come up, she looked down and saw Divinity checking her out. "You know, don't you?" she asked out loud, with no fear of being heard. He simply mewed, and that was all that was needed for her to know he wanted to be picked up. Divinity climbed from her palm up to her shoulder. He perched there, looking at her computer screen like he was interested. The sweetness of having something so warm and furry and cute at her cheek was irresistible. Blue leaped onto her lap. It was also adorable, but Gwen felt like she had to balance. She typed a little. The fact that she was draped in cats didn't seem to hamper her ability to work, so she went with it. Until Grandma Robbie came out and put a halt to it. "Okay, I get that you like them," she said. "Come on, Blue. Granny will get you treats." The big cat ran for the kitchen and waited for the older lady. Divinity stayed put, even when the sound of a can opening rent the air. "Won't you get kicked out of the kitty union if you don't run to the sound of food?" she asked the kitten. It was supposed to be a rhetorical question, but she got an answer. "No, I'm good," he said. This time the communication was not intuitive. It was not an auditory hallucination. This time the kitten spoke, and he sounded like Frank Sinatra. "That's quite a voice for a little guy," she said, trying to downplay the fact that her body shook from the inside out. "Nice and easy does it every time," said Divinity. That, she was certain, was a lyric from one of Frank's songs. She had to ask. "You aren't, anyone famous reincarnated, are you?" she ventured. The kitten laughed. "No," he said, "and not to be too cliché, but I can't divulge more than yes, I can talk, and yes, I have worldly knowledge. No other explanations or confessions other than I sure could go for a smoke." "A kitten who likes cigarettes?" she asked, completely stunned. I gave them up. I just could go for one, that's all. The pie and coffee Roberta served the other night, though I get the whole no people food rule, would have been the perfect time to enjoy a leisurely smoke. "They don't call them coffin nails for nothing," Gwen lectured. "Okay, I didn't mean to open a can of worms, though now that I think of it, they are kind of fun to bat around. Worms, I mean," he said. "So why reveal now that you can talk? Why not when you first arrived?" she asked. "Are you skeptical?" he asked with a laugh. "You do hear me, correct?" "It's a legitimate question," she said. "I just had to trust in my surroundings, And maybe I have the feeling you are going to need a co-pilot here shortly, he said. And you, a kitten who barely scrapes a pound, is volunteering? She chuckled. Or not, he said. I just thought I would offer my 2 cents. I appreciate it, she said. I still have a sense of humor. Har har, he said. Hold on to that. You're going to need it. Finally, Divinity hopped off her lap, flying in the air like a wee sugar glider. Gwen held her breath. It seemed like such a bold, precarious move. He trounced into the kitchen, no doubt for his share of Blue's bounty. I have invited Derek over for dinner, Grandma Robbie announced. Safe from her grandmother's view, Gwen made a face. Knowing that, now, she couldn't work. The cats weren't an issue. For some reason, having Derek Payne to dinner was. She put her laptop on sleep. I suppose I should tidy, said Gwen. That would be nice, dear, said Grandma Robbie. So, anyone else coming? Gwen called out as she folded up the pull-out to the secretary that was her computer desk. Her mind filled instantly with an image of Kevin. To her, he looked like a modern-day knight. If there was ever an opportunity to play dress-up for a costume party, she fantasized he was her date and that a knight and damsel would be their costume theme. No, it will just be us, said Grandma Robbie. That's going to be kind of awkward, said Gwen, now in the kitchen with her grandmother. You and I hardly know this man. Shouldn't we at least invite Emmy? Oh, I mean, it will be Derek and me, she corrected, as pleasantly as anyone could. Gwen found it a little difficult to have her feelings hurt in the face of a sweet smile, but it pinched just the same. Oh, she said. You're kicking me out. What will be my all clear? A tie on the door? That's your signal not to come in, Grandma Robbie corrected. If there is no tie on the door, the coast is clear. Did you learn that in college? Asked Gwen, not remembering if her grandmother attended. Or from Grandpa? No, dear, she answered minimally. How about you? Where did you learn about it? I read about it, Gram, Gwen replied in a, frankly, I'm shocked tone. First the munchies, and now this, thought Gwen. It was hard to look at Grandma Robbie in the same light, and now she had to make plans to be out of the house for dinner until a respectable hour, but she had to double-check. Really, Gram? Gwen asked. I'm not sure the 2 of you should be alone. You just met. I'm sure, said Grandma Robbie, with a silly grin on her face. I'll watch her, kid, said Divinity. Gwen shook her head. He was all of a couple ounces in body weight, and yet he sounded like the toughest persona in the town of Green. He almost imbued a sense of safety in Gwen. I'll be at Gunderson's, she said. It seems like all I do is cart my stuff to and fro, but I'll get some work done. I have a deadline Friday, and I've been so distracted. It will be quiet. I'm sorry to inconvenience you, said Grandma Robbie. No, she said. One of us should have a social life. After making sure the house was presentable, which really wasn't much of an effort, Gwen changed into some jeans and ran a brush through her hair. She loaded her laptop into a messenger bag. Okay, Gram, she said. If there's nothing else, I'm going. Good, Grandma Robbie said with gusto. Gwen was taken aback. What I meant was, he's going to be here soon, she amended. Okay, Gwen replied, studying her grandmother. She didn't quite believe that was, in fact, what she meant. I don't suppose you want to come with, said Gwen to Divinity. He just mewed. Blue looked longingly at her. Gwen fetched Emmy's old basket and set it down in front of the cats. She drew back the lid, and Blue climbed right in. I'll keep the baby, said Grandma Robbie. I think Blue could use a night out. I'm taking the Buick, said Gwen. Fine, dear, said Grandma Robbie, in a rush. The vibe was definitely mounting, and Gwen needed to step outside to relieve the pressure. The echoes of clip-clops growing louder and louder stopped the house in its tracks. Divinity's ears flattened, and his eyes bugged. He and Blue darted to the center, beneath the table. It was the sound of horse hooves. Gwen opened the door. Derek Payne was arriving in a horse-drawn carriage. Oh my word, declared Gwen. Window blinds up the street spread, and doors opened to behold the spectacle of Derek's arrival. What Gwen saw next nearly made her weep. It was an even younger Derek than the one who escorted her around the mansion earlier that day. His presence was overwhelming. Gwen thought her heart would break, it swelled so. He was breathtaking. He sauntered from the carriage, so sure of himself. He sported a dated coat that would have looked silly on anyone else less good-looking. His long hair smoothed and corralled at the ends in soft curls that coiled as he walked. He handed Gwen a bouquet of wild flowers. For you, milady, he said. He noted her messenger bag and the cat in the basket. Where are you going? He asked. I'm off to Gunderson's, she rasped. It was insufferable being so close to him only because it felt like being in love. She was on the verge of passion, and, while she knew it was magic, it was still irresistible. Oh, no, he insisted, lifted the strap from her shoulder. Dinner is here. Now lead me to your sweet grandmother so that I may bestow her flowers to her. Grandma Robbie, thought Gwen. This is totally intended to be a date for her, and now Derek is hitting on me, more or less. Come on in, she said. He paused and tipped his finger to her chin. It could almost be a prelude to a kiss, but he only meant for her to look him in the eye. The sighs of the universe whispered in her ears as she suddenly yearned to be swept up in his arms. You are inviting me in? He asked, oh so quietly. Are you certain? Of course, she said. She could faint with the delicious effect of his soft voice. After you, he said, and held the door. Grandma Robbie stopped in the middle of the living room. She was in a cotton shell dress and a fancy apron. Her shiny earrings matched the chunky necklace. She had dressed for Derek. Disappointment clearly registered on her face. Gwen felt as though she made a big mistake, and that sort of thing didn't happen between her grandmother and her often, if at all. Derek asked me to join you, Gwen explained, still hoping to get out of the predicament. I explained there was only enough for two. Derek quietly handed Grandma Robbie her bouquet. Gwen's was much grander than hers. You brought her 2 bouquets? Gwen fibbed. That's interesting. I'll just put these in a vase and be on my way. No, stay, dear, said Grandma Robbie stiffly. I forgot to mention Kevin is joining us. We'll have 4 for dinner. We'll have a lovely time. She took 2 more plates out of the cupboard and all but slammed them on the table. Grandma Robbie had never exhibited anger, as far as Gwen could remember. This was not like her, but then again, she had never shown interest in a man before, outside of stories of Gwen's grandfather. Is there anything I can do? Gwen rasped meekly. You've done quite enough, said Grandma Robbie. I'll go dress for dinner, Gwen barely managed. She lifted her eyes to Derek's. He was completely inured to the trouble he had caused. Divinity scampered after Gwen, but Derek stopped him. He made such a sharp, unexpected move that Gwen sucked in her breath, a little fearful for her kitten. I'll watch him for you, he said ominously, stroking the little beast ever so gently. Chapter 6. Gwen was slow in returning to the living room after changing her clothes, only because she wanted to let Grandma Robbie have time alone with Derek. While she felt just awful spoiling her Graham's dinner plans, she also wanted to take the opportunity to look good for Kevin. Not too nice. She didn't want her efforts to backfire and attract Derek. Her thinking was, though, if her being present could elicit jealousy from the least jealous person on the planet, her grandmother, perhaps Gwen would have some luck stirring the pot with Kevin. She chose a mauve shell dress and lighter cardigan in the same hue and slipped on heels. She spritzed herself with the lightest floral perfume. It was a chance to attract Kevin. She hoped her plans worked. Now, something told her she had to get out to Divinity. When she emerged from her room, Derek rose to his feet, ever the gentleman. Thankfully, Kevin was at the door. "A horse-drawn carriage?" he said, with the excitement of a 12-year-old boy. "Neato! I want to take a ride in that." "That sounds great," Gwen agreed. "Graham, Derek, would it be too rude if Kevin and I went for a whirl?" "No," Grandma Robbie answered quickly, but Derek said yes at the same time. He clarified, "I would be deeply offended if I were deprived of your company." "There'll be other times," Gwen countered, deflecting his attention coyly. Kevin was oblivious. He barreled into the house, following the delicious aroma. "Whatever is cooking smells great," he said. "Do you ever not think of your stomach?" Gwen asked under her breath. Now the fact she wore a dress seemed ridiculous. Kevin's one-track mind for food left Derek and Gwen alone in the living room. Fortunately, there was another knock at the door. "What in the world?" asked Grandma Robbie. "I'll get it, Graham," said Gwen. No, Derek objected. "Allow me. I realize you ladies have been on your own for quite some time, but I'm here now. I'll answer the door." Gwen called her mental library for any knowledge of whether, ever, answering the door was a man's job. She wasn't too keen on having this newcomer, handsome or not, tell her what to do, least of all in her own house. Derek opened the door to a beaming Mrs. Donaldson. She wore a dress and cardigan, same as Gwen, but in a loud floral print. Pinned to her chest was something that looked like a metallic Christmas ornament, a configuration of tinsel and silvered holly leaves. Gwen could not glean the thought process behind that choice. She just left it alone. "Roberta, good evening," Mrs. Donaldson said through a frozen smile. "I was just dropping by, but if you have company..." She pushed her way into the house so that she was safe from being shut out. "Oh, you're about to have dinner," she continued. "It is dinner time," Grandma Robbie growled. "Meow," Divinity joked. Gwen's eyes flared. "Ixnay on the meow may," she said. "No one can hear me," he said. Gwen scooped up the little creature for fear he would get hurt in the growing crowd. "Is there anything I can help you with?" asked Miss Donaldson to Grandma Robbie. Another member of the welcoming committee showed up at the door. In fact, when Gwen popped her head out the door, there was now a line forming at it. Gwen glared at Derek. "I'm going to ask you to turn off whatever it is you have running," she whispered, so as to be discreet. "You're disturbing the peace of a lot of little old ladies." "I do so love to hear you whisper," he flirted. Gwen noted that the background had frozen and that she and Derek were the only two moving. "I had only wished to court you," he said, trying to garner sympathy. "Milady." It took all of her willpower to resist his charms. "Would you kindly?" she asked demurely. "My grandmother made you a lovely dinner, and it would mean so much to me if you enjoyed it. Kevin and I will make our excuses and leave you two alone. Please?" "Only for you, milady." He bowed before her and then winked. It seemed like the gesture was too modern for him, but it nearly sapped her resolve. She had the strongest desire, though she knew it was his wiles working on her, to run away with him. But Derek honored her spoken wishes. He snapped his fingers. He was the distinguished older gentleman again, in an ordinary suit and tie. Gwen was in jeans, though he left her cardigan. The line dispensed, and suddenly Mrs. Donaldson had to tend to something in her oven. "I hope it's no one we know," joked Divinity. Despite the tension, Gwen had to chuckle at that. "Graham, Kevin and I are going to go for a ride," Gwen said. "You and Derek enjoy your meal." "But," Kevin complained. "I know a place," she said. "I'll buy." Derek shook his head for her benefit. He pinned her with those sensuous eyes of his. "Tss, tss, tss," he admonished. She headed out the door, thinking the horse and carriage would be there, but it reverted to an ordinary car. "Rats," she complained. "Some things come at a price," Derek intuited to her. Gwen nodded to indicate message received, but there was Kevin's strange motorcycle with a sidecar. "Take me for a ride?" she asked him. "We can go to the next town over and get you a giant meal of your choosing," she said. "Deal," he agreed. Gwen thought about Divinity, who read her mind. "You don't need to bring us with you," he said. "You and Kev spend time together. I'll be thinking good thoughts." But as Gwen sauntered down the middle of her lawn to Kevin's motorcycle, the desire to have Kevin finally pay attention to her vanquished. She looked over her shoulder through the veiled-covered window, and there was Derek, gazing down at her. He just had to look at her, and she was consumed with a powerful yearning. "Let me see if I can pull this off," Kevin toyed, and he held her hand to help her into the sidecar. "My lady." He bowed. The gesture only aggravated her. Gwen was beginning to feel like her grandmother. He handed her goggles and a helmet and donned the same. They were off. At first she was afraid, because she felt awfully vulnerable out in the open air, so low to the ground. But then she relaxed. The sky was wondrously dotted with the fairy lights of stars. The world was a magical collage of grayish-green hues. Gwen cast off Derek's warlock hold and enjoyed herself. At one point, Kevin looked down at her at the same time that she looked up at him. They shared a smile. Even with their insect-looking headgear, her heart warmed for him. He took her through the rising and falling country roads, past sweeping estates of unconscionably rich families, all the way into the next little colonial-age town. It had the same retro filling station, not as inviting as Gunderson's, but quaint all the same. It had a big drugstore with a counter and then its own family restaurant. But on the outskirts, just as the road ran out of town, was an Italian restaurant. The name was spelled Mario's in neon. "Shall we?" he asked as he eased into a spot. "Are we dressed?" asked Gwen, meaning appropriately. Kevin grinned. "I should hope so," he said. He lifted off his helmet and removed his goggles, and helped her do the same. He smoothed her hair. She reached up to tame his some as well. "It's a mess, isn't it?" she asked, touching her hair now. "It looks fine," he said with assurance. She believed the look in his eye. He wasn't Derek Payne. He was friendly to all, but he wasn't a ladies' man. Gwen was confident he found her attractive as she found him. Maybe not quite as much, but the mutual attraction was there. This time when he acted the gentleman by holding the door for her, she didn't mind one bit. Gwen traced the colored glass circles made from bottoms of bottles that created the stained glass in the entrance. "Pretty, huh?" asked Gwen. "Witch's glass," he said, and winked. That made her knees buckle. He must have sensed it, for he placed his hand at the small of her back and steadied her. As they walked, Gwen got to thinking. Kevin winked at her before, but it made her suspicious somehow. It made her think of Derek. "Two," he said to the young woman at the podium. Gwen revved up. The place was low lit, either by strings of white lights or candles. The tables were mostly filled, but diners spoke in a hush, so the atmosphere was peaceful. Kevin held Gwen's chair. "My lady," he said. She blushed. Now she liked that he said that, and that it was different from the way that Derek said it. "This is fun," she said, beaming at him. He smiled back. "It is." The tables were small. They leaned in so they wouldn't talk above the murmur of the other diners. Their faces were so close together, it gave them the opportunity to marvel at one another. Her crush on Kevin was renewed. "It's kind of a wonder how we ended up here instead of Graham's for dinner, but it is what they call a happy accident," he said. "I know. I am glad it happened," she said. They turned their attention to the menu. "Garlic bread?" he asked. "I thought you didn't," she began, but censored herself. "Are you worried my, condition will prevent me from enjoying pungent food?" he asked. "Yeah," she said. "Don't worry," he assured her. It was strange because Kevin was a paranormal, a vampire. Grandma Robbie watched what she cooked because of his sensitivities. Quin wasn't sure how he was able to manage it, but apparently he had. She didn't question him. She just went with it. "I won't," she promised cheerfully. "How about some wine?" he asked, and gestured for the waiter. "1 glass won't hurt," she figured. "I know this is not very adventurous," Gwen said, "but I'm having spaghetti. I gotta have spaghetti in a place like this." "We can always come back and try every dish," he said, lifting her finger to his lips. Gwen was electrified. She gushed and giggled and dropped her head. And when she lifted it again and looked him in the eyes, he smiled back at her. The waiter arrived. Kevin selected wine for them, which Gwen did not object to. When they each placed an order, the waiter laughed. "I apologize it was not clear," he said politely. "We serve our food family style, so 1 order is more than enough for 2. "Then spaghetti it is," said Kevin, passing off the menu. The waiter disappeared and returned with the wine, nestled in a bucket of ice. He started to pour it, but Kevin took over. "Thank you," he said. He tipped the bottle to Gwen's glass and then to his and invited her to intertwine their forearms. They sipped from their glasses while gazing into one another's eyes. A violinist emerged from the kitchen and played as he strolled. He stopped at their table and serenaded them. It was almost as if the daydreams she had about Kevin and her going on a date had come true. She hoped that Grandma Robbie was enjoying herself as much. It would be kind of a first for them to have girl talk about this kind of evening. It seemed like they sat and ate forever. Kevin started the trend of his feeding her salad, and then she returned the favor. When the spaghetti arrived, they were silly, laughing and twirling their pasta. At one point, someone told them, "Shh." Kevin covered his mouth contritely, and they simmered down. "Dessert?" the waiter asked, removing the leftovers to be boxed. Salad, garlic bread, and mounds of spaghetti got packed up and would rest on Gwen's lap while she rode in the sidecar. Kevin spilled more wine in her glass. "I can't," she protested gently. "I can't," he corrected. "You certainly can. You're not driving. Now, what about dessert?" "I won't fit in the sidecar if I eat any more," she joked. "Then you'll have to sit on my lap," he said, and winked again. She sat back in her chair, horrified. She was not having dinner with Kevin. She was having dinner with Derek, she was certain. "You," she said. He regarded her and then abandoned the charade. He morphed into his younger self. He looked similar enough to Kevin that the change went unnoticed by anyone but her. "How dare you?" she chastised him. "Is my grandmother having dinner with Kevin right now?" "She is," he said with a wicked grin. "And does he know?" she asked. "They're kind of suspended in time. In the morning, they'll recall whatever I want them to," he said, with no remorse at all. "I want Kevin to remember this evening," she hissed, "the one you stole from him." "Our dinner together?" Derek asked, a little taken aback. "Yes," she insisted. "I am sorry, milady," he said. "This one belongs to us." "But you only got it because I thought you were Kevin," said Gwen. "This is what I wanted with Kevin." "But I am the one who makes you feel the way I do," he argued. He was so cocky, so self-assured. She was infuriated. It didn't help that she had thrown wine on the fire. "I could slap you right now," she said. He winked. "You wouldn't be the first." "Stop doing that," she demanded. "Why? Because you don't like it?" he challenged and leaned in closer to her. "Or because you do?" The waiter was stiff with awareness that Derek and Gwen were having a fight. He set the check down and carefully stepped away. The check sat there. Finally, Derek raised his brows at her. "Huh?" she gasped. "Do you expect me to pay?" "If I was Kevin, you would," he said. "I'm not paying," she argued. "Milady, I am afraid the currency I have is not, well, current," he said. "But the work on your house?" she argued. "I'll sort that out," he admitted with mild embarrassment. Gwen whipped out her credit card and paid the check. She felt like the world's biggest sucker all the way home to the town of Green. Chapter 7. The house was dark when Derek pulled up. Its charm glinted in the moonlight, but it was cloaked in gray. That meant Kevin was gone for the evening, and Grandma Robbie was asleep. Gwen set the doggy bag onto the ground and hustled out of the sidecar. She didn't wait for him to put on any of his pretentious displays. He may have had the gestures of a gentleman, but she wasn't finding him to be one. Not at this moment. She wasn't even sure if she wanted the leftovers of their dinner, but she pinched the knotted bag and ran to the front door. The delay in her fumbling for the key gave Derek enough time to catch up with her. He called softly to her in the dark. "Gwendolyn," he implored her, as though she was overreacting. "Stop. Let's not part ways with you upset like this." "You have a lot to learn about what has changed between men and women since your day," she counseled firmly, "and I will thank you to give me some personal space." Derek stepped back and bowed, but Quin was very skeptical of this sudden concession. "As you wish, milady," he said gallantly. "Stop calling me milady, too," she blurted out. "I am not yours, and I am not a lady." "True," he agreed. "You're definitely a woman, but your manners could use some tempering." Gwen air-socked him. She took a swing even though he was much too far away to make contact. "Point made," he murmured darkly. Gwen happened to catch his eye as he waited for her to enter the house. His sure smile told her he was not fazed by her objection to his behavior. She wanted to stomp and throw a fit, not just shadow box, but she didn't want to wake her grandmother. "Whatever," she said, and closed the door behind him. She pressed her back against the front door as she listened for the motorcycles whir off into the night. She wondered for a moment how that would work, with his taking Kevin's ride and all, but that was more energy than she wanted to devote to the matter. She scouted the darkness for divinity or blue. So as not to wake her grandmother, she summoned them in a different way. "Kitty, Kitty," she thought. Immediately, she heard the sweet sound of tiny paws landing on the ground. "Meow," Divinity said, in such a tiny kitten voice. She shoveled him up into her palm. His light weight and fluff immediately soothed her savage temperament. "Come," she said in a whisper, and she wandered into her bedroom. She lifted a candle from atop her bureau and entered the bathroom off of her room. She would bathe by candlelight. She set the kitten on the shag rug and situated the candle in the far corner of the tub. As she lit it, she heard her bedroom door squeak. She froze, fearing it was Derek, until Blue poked her sweet nose into the bathroom. She relaxed and was very glad to see the older cat. "Going to join us, sweet girl?" she asked as she sat on the side of the tub. She drew a warm bath, dropping a lavender braid made of clippings from Grandma Robbie's garden. The steam lifted the floral fragrance throughout the room. Blue and Divinity cuddled on the fluffy rug as Gwen skimmed off her clothes and stepped into the rising water. She felt herself being tugged very quickly into another dimension. She shut off the water before she drifted too far. The buttery light of the candle flickered. She sunk down and rested against the bathtub pillow there. The urge to cry pressed at her, and she released softly. The evening had been so weird, and she had gotten her hopes up about Kevin. Grandma Robbie said it was best to follow the direction of such emotion because it made way for other things. It was true. As Gwen cried, the pressure left her, and she felt cleansed. She glanced at the cats reflexively. Their little faces were fixed on her. She scrubbed her face with a cloth to remove any Derek energy. She had wished so badly for Kevin energy, but if the evening had taught her anything, he had to want that too. He was just as content, if not more, hanging out with her grandmother, warlock shenanigans or no. Gwen closed her eyes, continuing to let go when something crashed into the tub. A bottle. She looked at the cats again, assuming it was one of them, but they had not budged. She sat up and lifted the bottle. It was bath oil, and some of it entered the water. She set it back in its place and splashed the oily water on her skin gently. When her nose was met with a strong smell of roses, she paused. She had no rose-scented bath oil. Gwen flipped the lever to drain the tub. She stood up, but before she could reach for the towel, it whipped off the bar and flung at her with just enough force that she could catch it. "Better knock it off," she called out to whoever might be listening as she quickly wrapped herself up. She stepped carefully onto the rug. The cats were very trusting and remained where they were. Gwen turned around to blow out the candle, but it was spontaneously snuffed out. She believed it was Derek's doing. "You shouldn't enter a lady's bath, at least without invitation," she snapped. "You have some nerve." The bathroom door opened for her, and the distinct sound of footsteps went ahead of her. Just as the streetlight spilled into her room, she saw the faint outline of a woman, an antiquated dress turned down her bed. She had the prettiest gray-blue velvet ribbon around her neck from which dangled a simple pendant. "Apologies," she said to the maid. "Thank you." "You're welcome," Derek communicated. "Oh, you," she scowled. "No thanks to you, and leave it to you to wake a maid who can't cross over just to wait on a person hand and foot." "Relax," he said. Still encased in a towel, she slipped a nightgown over her head. The cats followed her. Blue leaped easily onto the mattress as Divinity tried mightily to no avail. Gwen helped him up. She sat on the bed and felt someone brush off the soles of her feet. She laughed hard, for she was fiercely tickly. "Adorable," said Derek. "I am mad at you," she replied. but she laid back and slipped her feet beneath the cover. "Please go away." The maid drew the bedding up and over her and curtsied before the pale fragments of her spectre vanished completely. Gwen's head sunk into a feather pillow, and she slept. Her body did, at least, but not her brain. While her physical self felt as though it went to sleep, her mind picked up where the day left off. She saw the interior of her room. She got out of bed as though answering to a beckoning. It was Kevin silently summoning her. She frolicked slightly, the hem of her nightgown bouncing like the ends of her hair. She wandered out of the house, though there was not a neighborhood there. There were no telephone poles or street lights. There was just a full moon spotlighting their silhouettes as he tucked an errant lock behind her ear. They stood close, admiring one another, with smiles on their faces. Quin relished being so close to him, and just as it seemed like they were finally going to kiss, she was slammed with mistrust. Derek's wicked laughter filled the air, and all at once, she was standing with him, and not Kevin. Gwen sat up in her bed, breathing hard, light perspiration dampening her forehead. The cats jolted with her commotion. "Sorry," she apologized to them. It was just a dumb dream, she told herself. It was not real, but she could not go back to sleep. She would be awake for quite a while. She snuck out of bed for her messenger bag, still packed with her laptop, and brought it back to her room. She broke a personal rule, and that was to never bring work back to her bed. She worked for hours, actually accomplishing a lot, until she set the computer aside and fell into a dreamless sleep. When she awoke, both cats were looking at her. Divinity was contentedly tucked up and resting on her laptop keyboard. Her work was still up. She had to reverse some of the damage he had done by walking on it. "Are you helping me?" she asked, baby talking to him. "Anytime," he said in his heavy New Jersey accent. Tired as she was, she laughed. She had just cutesy talked to her kitten, who sounded like a gangster. She safely folded up her computer and got up to check in with her grandmother. She was just going to let her know that she might go back to bed, to sleep in a little, but all she found was a note. In perfect script handwriting it said, "Going to meet the girls to plan the party. Love, Graham." "Girls?" she said out loud. "Who does she know who could remotely be defined as girls?" "It's subjective," said Divinity. "Dames would be more like it." "Yeah," said Gwen. "We don't say dames." Blue made a cat noise that was just short of a meow, like she agreed. "That's right, Blue," said Gwen with adoration. "You're a lady. I suppose you two want me to feed you. Come." Gwen lifted the cat's bowls that Grandma Robbie had personalized with hand-painted names onto the kitchen counter and filled them generously with cat cereal. She set the dishes on the floor for them as she went to the sink to freshen their water. When she returned with a clean water bowl, Gwen noted that neither cat had even sampled their food. "What's up?" she asked. "It's not exactly like Granny makes it," answered Divinity. "What would you like? Biscotti?" Gwen asked, laughing at her own joke. "Do I make fun of how you sound?" Divinity countered. "Okay, how does Granny make your food?" she asked. "It's the wet kind. If she gives us the cereal, she always adds a treat like fresh salmon or white fish," said Divinity. "I think someone's spoiled," she said out of the side of her mouth. "Just saying." "I have baby teeth. Or maybe you had not noticed?" protested Divinity. Gwen tipped each bowl, one at a time, to return the contents to the bag. She opened up a can for each of them and gave them that, and found success. She plodded back to bed. It had to be 6-ish. Gunderson's was opened, and that was where she assumed Grandma Robbie was. But Graham could put together a party in an hour or less. She didn't need to get up at the crack of dawn to achieve that. Gwen called her cell phone while she cuddled in bed. "Hello?" Grandma Robbie sang. She was as goofy as when she first met Derek. She had to be under a spell. Gwen wasn't sure how far she should let this go on. Her grandmother was having a good time. "Where are you?" Gwen asked groggily. "I am at the welcoming committee meeting. We are planning Derek's welcoming party," answered Grandma Robbie. "Well, he kind of knows everybody, Gram," countered Gwen. "What's the point?" "A little thing called fun," Grandma Robbie answered. "Derek said we could have the event at his place." "His place is being renovated," argued Gwen, getting way more involved in the event than she cared to. "Don't be a party pooper, Gwendolyn," scolded Grandma Robbie softly. "Don't be a Debbie Downer." "Okay, I need to go back to sleep," said Gwen. "Come on down and help us," said Grandma Robbie. "I have to work," she said. "Work here," Grandma Robbie replied. "Actually, it works out," said Gwen. "You guys plan there, and I'll have the house to myself here and get a lot of work done after I catch up on my sleep." "Kevin said he had a wonderful time," said Grandma Robbie. "I don't think the man has stopped smiling." Gwen sat up in bed. "What?" she said. "He said he had a marvelous time," said Grandma Robbie. "I'm glad to hear it," she said. "I'll talk to you later." Now she was more confused than ever. She was a little too riled to go back to sleep, though she was tired. She grabbed her pillow and retired to the living room sofa, checking on the cats before settling down. They had scarfed up their breakfast, and they waddled out to join her. All she had to do was spread a blanket over herself, and they wanted to cuddle as well. She lifted Divinity. His little tummy was swollen, and his wee chin whiskers were dabbed with wet cat food. She laid him on her chest, and they both closed their eyes to sleep. She would swear someone tucked in the blankets around her before she faded into an intense morning nap. It was a turnaround for Grandma Robbie and Gwen that Grandma Robbie was away all day at Gunderson's, and Gwen was homebound, working. It actually worked out well because Gwen was contacted by a new client who wanted a huge project. The client paid up front and gave her free rein. It kept her busy and her mind off of things. It also worked out well for Grandma Robbie, too. Gwen had been thinking lately more than usual that her grandmother worked way too hard and deserved a break. And now she had one. When Grandma Robbie returned home from hanging out with the other members of the welcoming committee, dinner awaited her, as it had been for years and years when Gwen walked through the door. At first, Gwen racked her brain as to what to prepare. She even enlisted the help of the cats for inspiration. "Don't look at me," said Divinity. "My answer will never change." "Fish," said Gwen, deadpan. "You got it," replied Divinity. "If it ain't broke, don't fix it." But then Gwen thought of what her gram made. The same things, but they were her favorite same things, and that was what made their home a home, in part. So there was no more hard thinking. Gwen just went with what she knew. "That was easy," said Gwen out loud. "Nice and easy does it every time," said Divinity. Fortunately for Blue and the kitten, the first dish that Gwen made was tuna casserole. The kitties were treated to some of the fish minus the casserole, and Grandma Robbie drew in a big whiff of dinner as she spilled through the door. It made her smile, though the woman was genuinely a happy being. Despite being pleased that she had done something nice for her generous grandmother, Gwen's face drew up like a purse. Her grandmother was not the kindly, little old lady who pleasantly mocked conventions like the welcoming committee. She was reverting into a younger woman, a much younger woman, although it wasn't fully taking. Her hair was long and brown like the color of Gwen's, but beneath that youthful pallor was Grandma Robbie's older face. It wasn't like that when Derek switched up. "Gram, why don't you come in and sit?" said Gwen, trying not to show her concern so as not to alarm her grandmother. "I'll get you dinner." Grandma Robbie was as giddy as a schoolgirl. There was no other way to put it. "Fish," said Divinity. "It's the word of the day." The pause that followed the kitten's random words made Gwen think. He nodded at her. He had given her a directive. "Ask questions," he clarified. "Got it," she said, and chatted it up with her grandmother as she served dinner. "This looks wonderful," squealed Grandma Robbie. "So, you've been working on Derek Payne's party," began Gwen. "How's that going?" "Super," said Grandma Robbie. "And when do you think it will be?" she asked. "It's Saturday," said Grandma Robbie. Gwen was taken aback. "And you think his mansion will be in shape to host it?" she scoffed. "It's going to be a lawn party," said Grandma Robbie, her tone less and less mature. Gwen shrugged. "That's actually not a bad idea," she agreed. Her grandmother shoveled dinner into her mouth like she was starved. Gwen felt like she was the parent when she admonished her to slow down. "It's not going anywhere, Gram," she said, borrowing something her grandmother used to say to her. "Saturday night is practically here, you know. I suppose we should get our outfits together, but we can do that later," said Grandma Robbie. Gwen didn't have the heart to tell her that she didn't think she could go. She was working out a way to broach that when her grandmother changed the subject abruptly. She said, "Kevin and Emmy are coming over for dessert. I invited him." Panic flickered in Gwen. How could a person tell the difference between anyone and Derek posing as them? She wondered. "He's coming here?" asked Gwen. And right before her eyes, Grandma Robbie aged. Whatever the effects were of working on Derek's party wore off, though Gwen suspected her grandmother was not aware of them. "Yes, dear," she chuckled. "It's just Kevin. I'll put on a pot of half-calf." Gwen cleared the table, but not before exchanging looks with Divinity. "I'll keep my ear close to the ground," said Divinity. Gwen nodded and proceeded to set the dishes for washing. There was a knock at the door, and her phone dinged. She checked the phone first. Her mysterious client emailed her that the deadline changed, and they needed the work sooner rather than later. Gwen could do it, but it might mean not visiting even for a few minutes with Kevin and Emmy. "I'll get to work on it," she replied, "but I won't be available to work like this in the future." The money she was being offered was motivating, though living with her grandmother as she did, she wanted for nothing. Trading work for serenity was never a good deal. It was why she worked from home rather than for a big corporation. She texted as she power-walked to the front door. "Hi, guys," she greeted Kevin and Emmy as they crowded the entrance. "Come on in." "Gwendolyn," Kevin said, with a faint smile as he looked down his nose at her. "Long time no see." He balanced a Gunderson's pastry box on his fingers. Gwen got defensive and inadvertently assumed a power stance. "You are Kevin, right?" she challenged, her hands resting firmly on her hips. "What?" he laughed. "What in the world does that mean?" He playfully goosed the air, flirting with her. "Had a great time last night," he announced with a smile. She whipped around. The Kevin she knew wasn't this kind of flirtatious. "Now, I asked you, what in the world does that mean?" she demanded. "And maybe keep some conversations private?" Emmy knitted his brows. He, too, was trying to figure her out. "I thought we were visiting Roberta and Gwen Paris, not the local boxing ring," he remarked. Divinity bounced across the room and stopped at Emmy's feet. "Hello, Squet," Emmy said dismissively. "Anyone ready for dessert?" he asked. "Hope everyone likes blueberry tart." Grandma Robbie set the coffee carafe in the center of the table on a trivet. Gwen followed her with a tray decked with cups, cream, and sugar. Emmy, not Kevin, held Grandma Robbie's chair and then Gwen's. Gwen deliberated. She was tentatively assured the Kevin she saw before her was the actual Kevin. Emmy poured the coffee for everyone while Kevin cut the tart with a pie server. "This might be my new favorite," he said as the implement broke through the crust. "The lemony curd is tart and the blueberries are sweet, sort of like our Gwen, tart and sweet." Gwen turned her head as heat colored her face. Grandma Robbie and Emmy chuckled, but she herself was not so amused. "So, this welcoming committee party, are you okay with it?" she asked Emmy. "I don't see why not," he said. "But you don't like your cousin," she countered. "I tolerate him," he said, "and I get to help Kevin with the menu choices." Kevin leaned back proudly in his chair. "I'm catering the event," he said. At first, Derek objected because I don't exactly have a refined menu, but he relented. Relented, thought Gwen. That just wasn't a Kevin word. She didn't know what to believe. "Good for you," she said politely. "I have a pretty big commission. I'm not sure I can attend, but you all have a lovely time." "Gwendolyn," Grandma Robbie said, in as firm a voice as she had ever used. "You're joking, right? It's on a Saturday night. Surely you aren't working all weekend." "I thought I would," she answered. "It's kind of a once-in-a-lifetime project, and with the house to myself, I thought I could knock the project off." "This party is important to me," said Grandma Robbie. "Who is the client that saddled you with the project last minute?" "Business is business, Gram," she laughed. "It doesn't necessarily keep our schedule." "Well, perhaps this client would understand if we invited him or her to the party," she suggested. "I don't know who it is," replied Gwen frankly. "It's a mystery." "You're putting a mystery guest in before something that is very important to me?" she asked, just on the verge of shouting. She didn't look like a teenager, but she was acting like one. There was no doubt about it. Her grandmother was under a spell. Gwen and her grandmother never had words before. This was all so not like them. "Grandma Robbie, if it is that important to you," she answered in a tempered tone. "I was more inclined to agree with Emmy. I am not so impressed by Derek, and it would be hypocritical." "Well, I am impressed with Derek," Grandma Robbie countered, cutting her off. "We've grown fond of one another." "In a week?" Gwen scoffed a little too vehemently. In a rare show of temper, Grandma Robbie's eyes flared. She threw down her cloth napkin and departed the table. Gwen called after her. "If it means that much to you, I'll go," she said. She turned to Emmy and Kevin. "This is a disaster," she said. "I don't want to go, and neither of you backed me up." "Don't look at me," Kevin mused. "I just came over for dessert." "This is what my cousin does," Emmy offered finally. "He causes division." "Well, we are no exception," said Gwen. "The other night when Kevin and I were out having a lovely dinner," she choked up remembering it. "I was really sharing the evening with Derek pretending to be Kevin," she said, and covered her face with her hands. It sounded pretty ludicrous to admit out loud, but she was glad to finally get that off her chest. "Of course, I have no real confidence that you aren't Derek right now," said Gwen. "Either of you." "So, one or both of us could be Derek right now?" Kevin clarified. "That's what you're saying?" "All I know is that he copped to it," said Gwen. She turned randomly and saw Grandma Robbie there in the shadows, listening to the conversation. She stared Gwen down with such darkness. Maybe I spoiled you, I don't know, she said. But it's high time you grew up. I think it's time for you to find a place of your own. I need to move out? Asked Gwen, too blindsided to feel the pain from incredibly hurt feelings. And take your cats with you. Derek doesn't like them, she said. I'll look for a place tomorrow, said Gwen, shaking her head. No, now, Grandma Robbie insisted. I have plenty of room, said Emmy dejectedly. You can spend the night tonight. Kevin and I will come get your things in the morning. We will? Asked Kevin sarcastically. He just can't take things seriously, not this once, thought Gwen as she studied him. Yes, said Emmy. We will. Does that work for you, Roberta? It does, said Grandma Robbie tightly, and turned on her heel to retreat to her bedroom. Oh, for corn's sake, Gwen exclaimed, throwing her napkin down as her grandmother had. She scrambled from the table and immediately packed up her computer into her messenger bag. She gathered up things for Divinity and Blue. I love you, she said to the cats. It will be okay if they stay with you, right, Emmy? Fine, he said, primly. I guess I should help, said Kevin as a second thought. Gwen kept her eye on him. Not sure about that one, said Divinity. The mercy was only she could hear him. He might have been in a body that was only a few months old and weighed next to nothing, but Gwen trusted his judgment. Well, I finally get to live in the prestigious Hill neighborhood, she said sarcastically. Go put together an overnight bag. Yeah, sure, said Gwen. Let's be so casual about all of this. I cannot believe this is happening. She tossed a change of clothes, her pajamas, and toiletries into a small suitcase. She drew out the wagon for the cats. What's that? Asked Emmy. I'll walk up to your house, she said. You don't want to drive? He asked. Go ahead and I'll catch up with you, she said. I want to put away the dishes here. Tears finally stung her eyes. It was ironic that the first actual dinner she made for her grandmother, who took such great care of her for years, was also her last. It all happened so fast, and none of it foreseeable. It all came back to one thing. This was the work of a spell, and the spell could only be cast by one warlock, Derek Payne. In the midst of the storm that the drama caused, Grandma Robbie's true, calm warning parted the darkness. Love and tolerance repels black magic, she said. Anger fuels it, makes it work. Yes, thought Gwen. Yes. She took in a deep, cleansing breath and began to formulate her own plan. I'll go on ahead if you're going to walk, said Emmy. I'll get your room ready. I'll walk with you, said Kevin quietly. That is, if you believe I'm not Derek. She regarded him. Derek or Kevin, he sure was handsome. Even armed with Grandma Robbie's warning to keep a clear head, he was hard to resist. Sure, she said. I'd like that. So would I, Gwen, he said mournfully. It's a lovely evening, and I couldn't think of anyone else I'd like to spend it with. I should say goodnight to Grandma Robbie, even if she is mad at me, said Gwen. She stepped into the alcove that led to her grandmother's bedroom. I'm leaving now, Gram, she said, trying hard not to choke up. I'll see you in the morning. Grandma Robbie did not answer. Gwen dabbed a tear as she rejoined Kevin. She believed in her heart that this was going to blow over, but still, it stung like anything. Kevin hoisted the wagon, loaded with cats, out of the house and down to the sidewalk. Emmy had taken her bags, so all she had to do was pull the wagon. So, I don't know what you're talking about that I wasn't there with you the other night, he said, as though his feelings were hurt. Derek said he would fix it so that Kevin would remember the night as though he had lived it. I'm not sure what I was saying, she fibbed. I was just upset about my spat with my grandmother. It's been a long time since she's had a man interested in her, and vice versa, said Kevin. Go easy on her. She's acting like a schoolgirl, said Quin. Because that's how she feels, he countered. I know that what just happened back there was out of line, and I will help you sort it all out, but have a little patience. That's all I'm saying. The evening was so soft and the night sky clear, twinkling with beautiful stars. It was a brilliant backdrop to his handsome, earnest face as he reasoned with her about her grandmother. I will be patient, said Gwen. I get that you don't like Derek, he said. I don't completely understand it, but I respect it, he said. I was kind of hoping you would go to the party with me. The trek to Emmy's was not far. It was just up a pretty decent incline. Gwen checked on the cats. Her heart brimmed with love for them, as they were such good troopers being transplanted this way. She knew that Divinity understood what Grandma Robbie had said, but she wondered about Blue. Blue had always been sweet and grateful as an older rescue cat. Gwen was saddened as she recalled Graham's dismissive words. She was mean to the cats, Kevin, Gwen said. That's Derek's doing. Maybe that will help you understand my dislike of him. 9. Before they knew it, Kevin and Gwen were at Amy's door, which was really a door to a house owned by Kevin. Still, Kevin didn't just barge in. He very politely said his goodnights to Gwen and the cats under the light of the portico. Well, he said, as rough as it was, I enjoyed spending some time with you. I know you say Derek was me on your date, but I'll always believe it was me, and I'll treasure the memory for a very long time. Gwen almost believed he was about to kiss her. She felt as though she would welcome it, but Emmy, with his perfect timing, burst open the door to help his guests in. Kevin, he said, nightcap? I'm going to pass, Emmy, he said, with a touch of melancholy. He looked at Gwen with soulful eyes. Gwen wanted so badly to believe him. She could use one of his magical bear hugs right about now. The numbness over having bickered with her grandmother was wearing off for sure. She wasn't going to sleep, not in this strange place, as comfortable as it might be. Work was going to be her only medicine, as far as she could figure. Good night, she said solemnly. See ya, he said quietly, and he rescinded into the darkness. Gwen entered the high-ceilinged home with its stone entrance. Bright art clad the walls. In such a short time, Emmy had really transformed the place. The house was more him than it was Kevin. Either way, Emmy knocked the doom and gloom out of it that had been there when its former tenant resided there. I think I will just work, said Gwen shyly. I have a space here that you can use as a desk, he said hospitably. It was a desk that was more or less ornamental because it didn't appear that Emmy had a chance to use it. It was fashioned out of the same light granite that created the entrance and the build-outs. Thank you, she said. I can work in my room. I don't want to bother you. Nonsense, he said with a laugh in his voice. Remember all those late nights when you worked round the clock either on schoolwork or work? And you kept me company, she recalled fondly. I will be in my room, he said. I won't hear a thing. Your cats are settled. They can have the run of the place. I set out the cat food and their bowls in the kitchen. They should be easy to find. Just as he was about to disappear into his own bedroom, Gwen called to him. Emmy, Graham is really stuck on Derek, isn't she? I'm afraid she is, he replied solemnly. I think at this point the only thing we can do is be there for her. You don't think we should become a couple of flies in that ointment? She asked. He's not a good guy. I think after you work, you should get to bed and sleep on whatever idea you're cooking up in that pretty little head of yours, he said. It was an answer without answering. He had already set up her laptop on the desk. All she had to do was turn it on. When she accepted the commission, she only wanted it as a distraction. But now that she might actually be looking for a place of her own, the money was certainly going to come in handy. She uploaded the client's coat of arms graphic that he wanted to use as a sort of brand element. It was written in a language she didn't understand, and she didn't have any luck researching it. There were no hits on the internet. That was as far as she went. It was an attractive graphic with lots of interesting, usable colors. She did a little setup and then decided more coffee was in order. She abandoned her desk momentarily to brew some, then heard a sound like the hull of a boat running ground. "What in the world?" she asked as she followed the noise. It was Emmy in a silk dinner jacket, squawking in horror. "Where did you get this?" he demanded. "That's my client," she said. "I was just making coffee." "And I was just coming out to make you some coffee," he echoed with urgency. "This is my family coat of arms." "My mystery client," Gwen began with horror. "Is Derek," he said, cupping his mouth, clearly thinking. "Do you think he gave you the job as a way to flatter Roberta?" Just the opposite, she thought. He's working on Graham to get to me. But Gwen didn't want to come off as pompous. She would lose what few allies she felt she had. "Could be," she said with a nod, while she formulated a plan to visit Derek in the morning. She would issue an ultimatum, as soon as she could figure that out, to leave her grandmother alone. "You know, I think I will pass on the coffee," she said. "Sleep is beckoning me after all. Good night." Emmy studied her like he wasn't sure. "Very well, then," he agreed reluctantly. He watched as she folded up her computer and turned off the lamp adjacent to it. "Good night," he said. Gwen scooped up the kitten and clicked to Blue. "Come, sweetheart," she said, tender-hearted that Grandma Robbie was kind of harsh. She explained it to the cat. "She didn't mean it," Gwen said, "and know that I will always love you." "Lucky, lucky," Derek murmured. "I'll deal with you tomorrow," she said, and despite her reservations, she rolled over and fell fast asleep. But waking up was tough. There wasn't that hope of ideas that Gwen had rattling around in her head the night before. Now she had to find a way to put those ideas in motion, and that would depend a lot on her grandmother. She rose early, packed Divinity up in Emmy's old basket, and marched down the hill at the break of day to her house. She knocked on the door and waited for Grandma Robbie to answer. What Gwen was greeted with shocked her to her core. Grandma Robbie looked to be in her 20s. Gwen quickly snapped a picture with her camera. Grandma Robbie's face sharpened with disapproval. "Now stop that," she ordered. Surely Gwen wasn't the only one who noticed this drastic change in her grandmother. Surely she wasn't the only one who saw there was cause for alarm. But when she reviewed the picture, it was of her grandmother as Gwen knew her. A kindly, attractive older lady. She rolled her eyes with frustration. "Sorry," Gwen played it off. "I just came by to see if I could borrow the Buick. I need to tell my client I can't work this weekend, but I would like to do that in person." "Don't do anything on my account," Grandma Robbie said, reaching for the keys, which hung from a hook just inside the door. "Why not?" Gwen asked sweetly. "You always do things on my account. I think it's high time I return the favor." Grandma Robbie palmed the keys into Gwen's hand. "Spare me the sweet talk, will you?" she said, her brow arched as she closed the door in Gwen's face. "Great," muttered Gwen, and then called out to her from the outside of the house. "I'll be quick! I know you want to go to a planning meeting or something." Grandma Robbie reemerged to fire back. "Derek is picking me up, so don't worry." "We'll see about that," Gwen said under her breath. The late model Buick filled up the entire driveway. She and Grandma Robbie called it a boat and joked that all you had to do to get anywhere in town was to travel the length of the car. It maneuvered smoothly as she tooled through the neighborhood, out to the main road, all the way out of town and into the Perryville Foothills. She was going to pay Derek Payne an unscheduled visit. There would be no hiding the fact that someone from the Paris household was visiting Derek. The car, though not the size of a cargo truck, could easily be seen through the window of Gunderson's. It wouldn't escape anyone with mild curiosity. She cut into Derek's drive, and though still surrounded by ancient trees, it was now nicely paved. The asphalt reminded Gwen of dark chocolate cake. It was so rich and smooth. She noted that though there was obvious work being done, the workers managed to do so without causing a destructive mess. The house looked quite habitable, and Gwen could easily envision a party being held here. No matter what was about to transpire between Derek and her, she hoped that the party everyone was looking forward to could still go forward. She sauntered up the stairs, and the door flew open before she could knock. "Come in," Derek greeted her in his youthfully handsome iteration. "You're a wicked warlock. You know that, Derek Payne?" she said as she brushed by him. Their faces were but a breath apart. Their eyes met, and the charisma that emanated off of him zapped her mildly with its dangerous current. It was a welcomed reminder for Gwen to keep her head while dealing with this paranormal. "To what do I owe this pleasure, besides you?" he asked her smoothly. "And why on earth did you bring that rodent along with you?" "Rodent?" Divinity asked indignantly in his New Jersey dialect. "Remind him I know people, not a threat. Just saying." Gwen would have laughed if she weren't in such a hurry. She had no time to indulge anyone. "You are my mystery client, are you not?" She got right to the point. "I am," he admitted with a gleam in his eye. "I'm returning your money and ending the work," she announced primly. "Oh, but why?" He pretended to pout in such a way that nearly made her faint. He was sexy even when he was being a smart aleck. "You know why, Derek," she insisted. "The welcoming committee is throwing a party for you, and every little white-haired lady in town is smitten with you, including my grandmother." "And what does that have to do with the fact that I need some marketing done, and you are the most competent person for the job?" he countered smoothly. And as cool as he was, he made her roar. She cackled, much to his dismay. When she gathered herself, he was genuinely bothered that she was laughing at him. "Derek," she said, catching her breath. "What the heck do you need a marketing campaign for? Everyone here hangs on your every word." "Everyone?" he asked, cocking his brow. Gwen found herself off, drifting further away from the point she came there to make. "I'm afraid you're going to hurt one of these sweet little white-haired old ladies," she whispered. He responded in a similar tone. "They didn't get to be white-haired old ladies by being limp lilies," he said. "They could handle life, Gwendolyn." "But they're dear to me," said Gwen. "They mean nothing to you, and my grandmother, believes you are interested in them, her, and she returns the sentiment." "Cannot return what is not given," he said without missing a beat. She snapped her fingers and pointed at him as though she caught him. "Exactly," she said sharply. "You're toying with them." He circled her. "Not her," he corrected, with the prowess of a skilled predator. She nodded. He affirmed what had entered her mind. "That's what I thought," she responded. "You're interested in me." "I'm toying with you," he amended. "But yes, oh yes, I am interested in you. But Roberta, when she's around me, is as giddy as a schoolgirl, and she bears a striking resemblance, don't you think?" "So, you can see her as a young woman," Gwen remarked with disdain. "You're messing with her wondrous heart, and I won't abide by it." "I am a wicked warlock. Isn't that what you just said?" he asked in the quietest of voices. "What are you going to do about it? Look where you are. I've separated you from your hearth and home. Even those closest to you outside your family aren't quite on your team, and you are in my house as we speak. I would say that's check and mate." Gwen grounded quickly and conjured a quick prayer. She remembered not to get emotional, lest all her powers would be rendered worthless. "Maybe so," she said. "I should just throw in the towel." "Throw in the towel?" he asked, as though her slang threw him. "I will do business with you, but it will be our secret, for now, until I say otherwise. How about that?" she asked. "What are you talking about?" he chuckled. "Leave the ladies alone. Leave Grandma Robbie alone." "And what do I get in return?" he asked darkly. "I'll do your marketing, even though, let's face it, you might as well just give me the cash if you want me to have it. And what?" "And you'll go to dinner, but this time with the actual me. As the two of us," he whispered. "Fine," she said, "but you better act like the gentleman you pretend to be." "I am wounded," he teased. "And I want you to accompany me to the party," he said, batting his long eyelashes. "You hurt her feelings," argued Gwen. "That's precisely what I want to avoid. That's why I want this to be kept on the down low." "I'll see to it that no one will be harmed," he said, taking more and more liberty to stand even closer to her. She couldn't lie to herself that she didn't like the way he felt when he stood so close. His allure was fairly intoxicating. It was so hard to keep a clear head. But so long as he spared her grandmother's heart, she would pay the price. "And what about Kevin?" he asked. "What about him?" she asked. "You like him. You're nearly as protective of him as you are of your grandmother," said Derek. "He's not interested in me," she admitted, though it made her whole middle ache. "We'll still be friends." "Oh, I give him more credit than that, even if you don't," he scoffed. "But you give me your word you've given up on that?" "Speaking of that, what does your word mean?" she asked, realizing she was about to enter into an agreement with the likes of him. "Everything, milady," he assured her. "But you aren't Kevin's date tomorrow?" Her eyes spread as wide as was physically possible. "I think he might actually be," she rasped. "I can fix that, you know," he offered. "No, I'll do it," she said. "I'll take care of it. I owe him that much." "So honorable," he purred. Now Gwen was in a jam. She would have to stop at Gunderson's on the way back to return the car to Grandma Robbie's. She was going to have him upset at her for breaking their date, and Grandma Robbie was annoyed because she was going to be longer than she promised. "I wish you would let me help you," he said sympathetically. "You're the reason I'm in this mess," she hissed. He winked. She tried not to be so obvious in her reaction, but his little eye flutter made her inside shake in a very good way. He said in a wondrously rich voice, "The event is tomorrow night. Shall I send a carriage for you?" "I'm staying with Emmy for the time being," she said. Derek jerked with alarm. Gwen was taken aback by his reaction. "What's the big deal?" she asked. "Nothing," he said, though she sensed that was a lie. "I'll find my way to your house," she said. "I look forward to the vision of your entrance," he said, bowing slightly. "Whatever," she murmured, and walked out of the mansion the way she came in. Chapter. The weight of the vintage car impelled it down the slope of the foothills, back into town where Gunderson's nestled at the base. Serving so many needs to the out-of-towner, weary traveler, and locals, Gunderson's was an oasis of sorts. It was befitting that the morning sun bathed it in gold as Gwen glided in, pulling into a vacant parking spot right by the door. It was practically ordained, she thought. She dashed into the eatery side with Divinity on her arm, thinking this would be a quick stop after all. "Hi, Jolene," she said to the girl behind the counter. "Is Kev around?" "In his office," she answered. "What's in the basket? Is that a new kitten?" Without warning, Jolene stepped around the counter and blocked Gwen's passage to the garage side of Gunderson's. "Yeah, but I'm in a hurry," said Gwen. Jolene tugged the basket handle. "I'll kitten sit while you talk to Kevin," she offered. It was a strange situation, because Gwen had the overwhelming urge not to be rude, even in the face of Jolene's boldness. It was confusing because Jolene was smiling and seemingly offering to help, but she was almost impossible to bypass, a force to be reckoned with. Gwen recognized this as little magical ants, as though someone enchanted her passage to prevent it. "Out of my way," Gwen ordered darkly. Jolene's face morphed with mischievousness, and she stepped aside. Gwen didn't have time to figure out what that was all about. She reached for the handle of the door, and it was locked. Jolene tried the door, and it opened. "It's fine," she demonstrated. "Try it now." Gwen did so and could not. "You're hilarious, Jolene," hissed Gwen with frustration. "I am not sure whose agent you are, but I'm going to tell you once again to knock it off. Whoever you're working for, I am not interested." Gwen spoke loudly into the air to nothing in particular, so that the forces that were orchestrating this bit of nonsense would hear her. She didn't care if any of the eatery diners looked at her funny. Finally, the door opened for her, and she was able to pass through. She peeked her face into Kevin's office. He looked so stern and responsible as he focused on the administration of his business. He was all smiles when he realized she was there. "Well, there's my date for the party," he greeted her. His words could not have crushed her more than if he had struck her. This was not going to be easy. She wondered if he had not seen her coming, and it was he who threw obstacles in her path to tell him that she was, in fact, not his date. "Kevin," she began slowly, "when I accepted your invitation to the party—" "Oh, no," he interrupted her. "No. I woke up in such a good mood this morning, and it was because you said you'd go with me, and I heard from Grandma Robbie that you would even try to invite your mystery client." "I have," she responded with a sigh. He was already always going to attend." "Oh, really?" asked Kevin jealously. "It's Derek," she confessed, "and since I promised my grandmother, I am going with him." "Wait a minute," he ordered, sitting up straighter in his captain's chair. "You are going to be Derek's date as a favor to Graham, who has a thing for him?" Gwen pulled out her phone to review the picture she snapped of Grandma Robbie earlier that day. It had changed. It had captured her grandmother as a younger woman who, as Derek pointed out, looked remarkably like Gwen. She showed it to Kevin. "Look at this," said Gwen. "It's Graham," he remarked dismissively. Gwen checked it again, and the picture reflected her grandmother's likeness in the present time. "Well, that's because it changed," she explained. "What this picture does is fluctuate from young to old. My grandmother's crush on Derek is changing her." "That's what love does, Gwendolyn," Kevin said pointedly. "And Derek Payne is the kind of guy who would take you when he had already asked your grandmother. I can't go to a party honoring him, so I don't need a date anyway. If you'll excuse me, I have work to do." A gust of wind pushed at her, escorting her out of Gunderson's and back to her car. The brilliant spring day was no longer vivid and colorful. It was gray and dormant, as if in the midst of a natural disaster. There were no cars at the gas pumps, and the houses as she crossed the main road into her neighborhood looked vacant. Gwen parked in her drive and knocked on her door, but there was no answer. She tried the doorknob, and it was unlocked, but since she was not invited in, a very big deal among paranormals, even gentle witches like herself, she did not enter. She dropped the keys in the mail slot and texted her grandmother to let her know. Gwen climbed back to Ammy's house in long, purposeful strides. Divinity popped his head out of the basket and looked around. She could feel him studying the situation. "I'm not sure I like this," he said. "I think we are in another realm. I'm not sure when it happened, but it has." Gwen was immediately worried that the kitten, though tough and mighty in spirit, was far too vulnerable to withstand this atmosphere. She knocked on Ammy's door, and the door drew open for her. Though there was no verbal invitation, this sufficed as permission to enter. The house, so spacious, could be shelter for many people and would seem vacant upon entry. But the emptiness that Gwen experienced told her that was not the case. She was, as Divinity pronounced, in another realm, and there was no connecting to others at this point. As she explored the circumstances, Gwen was greeted with a gown hanging from a stand with a note pinned to it. As she read, it was in Derek's mellifluous, dark voice. "I took the liberty," he wrote. "Why bother?" she called out in frustration. "No one is coming. And by the way, I don't know what is up with this alternate realm nonsense, but you can't keep me in a cage." "Perhaps it's not I?" he suggested. "What's that supposed to mean?" she asked. "Of course it's you. Or someone, or someones, perhaps, who don't want to see the two of us together," he said. Gwen scoffed, but the more thought she gave to it, the more plausible it became. "Maybe," she said. "I don't 100% believe you, but maybe." The maid who had assisted her with her bath and turned down her bed after Gwen's date with Derek materialized fully. Gwen knew it was her because she wore the gray-blue ribbon around her neck. She maintained some transparency, but, for all purposes, was solid and trackable. She was completely silent, never cracking a smile. "You're despicable," Gwen called out to Derek. "Leave this poor woman alone." "What?" Derek replied from his invisibility. "I've given her a job." "Yeah, just what everyone wants," snipped Gwen. "To work forever." "Oh, very well," he reluctantly agreed. There was a mild earth tremor, and the spectre maid transformed. She was modern-looking, give or take a decade, still sporting the blue ribbon, which looked quite stylish. She reclined on Ammy's settee, reading a magazine. Her face looked more relaxed, but she was quiet. "Can't you do something to help her? You know, where she would like to go?" asked Gwen. Their conversation continued, with just Gwen physically present. "Believe it or not, I honor a certain amount of free will. The resolution of her mortality is up to her and to a power greater than myself. I was just putting her to good use while she was here," he said. "Yeah," scoffed Gwen. "I'll bet. Now get me out of this stupid alternate realm, or is that up to me as well?" Asked and answered, Divinity intuited. "Tell that rodent to keep his gangster yap zipped," Derek snapped, losing his cool. "You don't worry about alternate realms or any of that, or even working, for that matter. I will thank you to try on the gown and to let me admire you." "I'm not getting dressed, what with your tendency to be anywhere at any given moment. You can hear me. I know you can see me," said Gwen. "On my honor," he promised. "I shan't peek until you are fully clothed. Please? I picked the dress specially for you. I want so little." "And you'll break my grandmother's heart and Kevin's heart to get it," she replied glibly. Thunder shook Ammy's hill mansion, and that was no easy accomplishment, considering it was fraught with granite. "What do you care of Kevin Pearson's heart?" Derek rumbled. "As long as you leave them alone and let them get on with their lives with no further heartache, nothing. I'll put on the dress since there's not much else I can do in this realm," Except for work, because I need to fulfill my commitments, speaking of honor. You better figure out a way to get me out of here." She wheeled the dress hanger into the guest room and closed the door. She set Divinity on the bed. He hopped out of the basket and curled in the crevice of pillows. Gwen lifted the dress from the hook and let it collapse onto the floor. It was incredibly heavy and complicated, but she skimmed off her clothes down to her undergarments and let her intuition be her guide. Divinity closed his eyes. She stepped into the dress, and, with magic, it was lifted up her form onto her shoulders and laced into place. Quin glided across the floor to admire herself in the 3-paneled, full-length mirrors. It was a ridiculously impractical dress, but incredibly beautiful. The color was a pale sea green, and it billowed in flows of silk and tulle. The same forces that figured out the garment for her also did her hair. It was twisted in a crown around her head and dotted with pearls. She wore white gloves up to her elbows. It was so not the appropriate dress for what had intended to be a simple garden party. The fabric was too fine to be allowed to drag along the grass and too heavy to comfortably transport. It was a workout just to stroll. The weight of the dress made its novelty short-lived, and Gwen wished to be rid of it. She wished it so, and immediately the dress unlaced itself. She emerged from the guest room in her jeans and t-shirt. Derek was seated at Emmy's dining room table, awaiting a show, apparently. "What?" he gasped at the sight of her in her everyday clothes. "It fits," she said casually. "Of course it does," he replied, his temper simmering. "I wanted to see it." "You'll have to wait until the party," she said. "You shall see it then." Derek boiled. Gwen nodded with satisfaction to know that patience was not his strong suit. Grandma Robbie reminded her time and again that that was a magical weakness. If only she could find a way out of the realm he put her in. "So, what am I supposed to do between now and the party?" asked Gwen. "I am not one of your ghosts. I do have a life. Or at least I did before you came along." "Again, talk to your granny and your boyfriend," he said. "I'd love to, but I'm in a warp at the moment," she complained. "You can work on your project for me, as you said," he smiled, very satisfied with himself. She heard a muted sound, like someone was speaking on another floor, and the sound was filtered through the wall. Gwen's eyes darted to Derek, who looked very suspicious. She suspected the life being lived in the normal world was seeping through. "I'll find a way out," she warned him. "That will be my project." "Just be my guest at the party. Spend one evening with me," he said, "and I shall find a way to release you to your life." "And you'll leave Kevin and my grandfather and all those I love alone?" she asked. "I didn't say that," he chuckled wickedly. Gwen grabbed a pillow and chucked it. It was a lame display of temper that made Derek laugh. He twirled a crystal sphere that had sat on a stand on a built-in shelf. To paranormals, crystal balls were not just knickknacks. They were useful tools of fortune-telling. Before Gwen could lecture him further, he evaporated. It didn't feel to her as though he was just invisible. It felt as though he really left. He had set the crystal ball on the dining room table, and she was drawn to it. She had just intended to put it back where it belonged, for were it to roll, it could be dangerous to Divinity. But when she lifted it, a current of magic gave her a little shock. She held it up to the light to see what she could see. Gwen only knew about some magical practices through her grandmother, who was a gentle witch. There were times when Gwen had to pull through in a pinch by summoning her powers, mostly relying on faith. While she couldn't get out of the realm she was stuck in, she wondered if she could catch a glimpse of her grandmother, Emmy, and Kevin via the crystal ball. "Do you know how this works?" she asked Divinity. "I've seen dames wave their hands over them like they're clearing a cloud, he answered. That's in movies, said Gwen. For a reason, he countered. Maybe the kitten had a point, and so Gwen mimicked the moves of big-screen fortune-tellers. And nothing. But when she put the ball on its stand, it caught daylight and turned on. There was Gwen's grandmother and Kevin sitting at the table in her house, eating lunch. I guess they're okay, she said, assured. Now, if there was a way for me to traverse into that realm. There's an opening. It's pretty small, said Divinity. The maid showed me. Small. Could I fit through it? Asked Gwen. No, but I can, said Divinity. And with that, he pounced across the room and disappeared before her very eyes. Chapter 11. Come back here, Gwen shouted. Come back! She followed Divinity to the very spot where he vanished, but felt nothing. Come back, she called out. I'll be all alone. She turned to the maid, still contentedly reclining on the settee. Gwen rolled her eyes. Derek, she called, I demand you release me. All in due time, milady, he said in a rich, mocking tone. All in due time. I mean, of course, I will get your grandmother and Kevin, too. All in due time. Gwen's only strategy was to wait. She had no way to get back to the normal realm and had no choice, at least at the moment, but to hope that Derek would honor his word. It would only be less than a day until she was back with her friends and family, where she belonged. She sat at her computer, working on all her projects, occasionally breaking to check out the crystal ball. The first vision she turned into was of Divinity charming Emmy. Emmy, who had been a cat himself, pretending to be standoffish to Blue and the kitten, spoiled the little guy to no end. But where is Blue? Gwen wondered. Maybe Grandma Robbie had come to her senses and taken the sweet girl back. Gwen looked. The scene in the crystal ball jumped from Emmy's house to the welcoming committee members setting up in Derek's lawn. Gwen was confused. There was Grandma Robbie, in her senior iteration, working way too hard. Just when she was about to wonder where all the guys helping to set up were, there was Kevin, happy-go-lucky as usual, except for when they parted the other day, jovially setting up. Derek was there, sharing laughs with him as though they were best friends. No one missed her at all, so that was good. Maybe Derek kept his word and prevented her loved ones from being upset that he was interested in her. Or so she thought. Gwen worked and worked to pass the time. She broke to fix herself something to eat. There was food in the house that she could cook, but she didn't have the heart. She spilled cereal into a mid-sized mixing bowl. It was a new box of her favorite flakes and freeze-dried strawberries. Gwen ripped open the cardboard and shook the box, the flakes tinkling against the glass. And wouldn't she know it, the ruckus of the cereal falling into the bowl sent Divinity racing. He emerged from the other realm with dust in his whiskers from travel. He hopped up on the counter and meowed, thinking he was going to be fed. Where have you been? She scolded him softly. On the other side, he replied. I'm starved. You cats are always starved. Hold on. I'll open up some wet food, and you can give me the deets, she said. She poured almond milk over the cereal. Oh, he disparaged the almond milk. Way to ruin a meal. Sorry, she chuckled. I prefer it to cow's milk. Sacrilege, he joked. She opened a tin of cat food and dumped it on his plate. She just happened to look in the direction of the maid who had been fine with resting on the settee. The maid sat at attention, her eyes fixed on Divinity's meal. The kitten gobbled so quickly, the food was almost gone as fast as Gwen opened the can for him. Okay, he said, licking his lips. Here's what I know. Gwen hoisted her mixing bowl full of cereal and moved over to a high-backed Queen Anne. The kitten leaped to the coffee table and reported. "Everyone's very upset," he began. As soon as he said that, the house shook. The maid gripped the arm of the settee, terrified of the noise, but remained silent. "Wow," said Divinity, looking around with fright. "Maybe I should just let you find this stuff out." "What?" asked Gwen. "Find out what?" "I don't know nothin'," said the kitten in his thick street accent. Gwen consulted the crystal ball. Just as she reached for it, the house trembled again, and the crystal dropped from its stand and landed on the ancient pine planking. The ball rolled ominously towards the coffee table in Divinity's direction. "Knock it off, Derek!" Gwen shouted. She stopped the ball with her foot and picked it up to examine it. She saw for herself. Grandma Robbie and Kevin were upset, and it seemed over the fact that she was missing. Gwen talked to them through the crystal ball. "I'm coming back," she said. "I'll be there soon enough." "Remember your promise, milady," warned Derek. "Remember yours," she said feebly. In reality, what could she do? She didn't know how to get out of the realm. She might have power equal to his, but she didn't know how to harness it. She let the deal play out to see how it unfolded. "Why are they crying?" demanded Gwen. "Are they the ones who locked me in this stupid warp? And was the prior vision I saw of them having a good time at the party a false vision?" "That was me," said Divinity meekly. "I told them what was going on." "Rodent!" Derek boomed. "You better not harm a whisker on his head," she warned protectively. "Sorry there," he said. "I thought they should know. The news seems to set them straight. They don't seem to be starry-eyed over our wacky warlock." Lightning spazzed and thunder boomed. Divinity flinched. His little claws dug into her palm. "Sorry," he apologized. "He just knows how to get to me." The maid was under the coffee table. This was all too weird. "Pick on someone your own size," Gwen called. "And besides, you're going to ruin the lawn with all these thunderstorms. I won't be able to wear the dress." "I'll see about that," Derek bellowed. And just like that, Gwen was dressed in her party gown. The sun was setting, and the air was perfectly temperate. Time had fast-forwarded, and it was now the hour of the garden party. With the exception of waiters and maids, so far she was the only guest who showed. Gwen looked around to see what she could see. She stepped forward, but her dress was indeed very heavy, and though it wasn't really hers and she didn't give one whit about fancy stuff, she felt compelled somehow to take care of it. The setting sun was temporarily blocked by a shadowy figure. It was Derek, walking out of nothingness like a gallant hero. He was so intensely good-looking as Kevin, but she had to admit to herself that his mischievous nature gave him incredible allure. Her eyes met his, and they held one another's gaze until she was fully entranced. "Milady," he greeted her, taking her fingers and almost pressing them to his lips, but bowing instead. He looked like a musketeer with a tri-cornered hat with a plume cascading to the side. His hair was full and long, in soft rippling curls, while hers was twisted and tucked artfully. "We're the only ones here, minus a gazillion servants," she whispered. "That's the way it should be," he said. "You're the only one I care about." "I must admit, you puzzle me," she offered. "And why is that, milady?" he asked, with a slight smile and a tilt of his head. "No offense, but you could make any woman fall for you, and yet you chase one who is in direct competition with another woman and whose heart longs for someone else." He pressed his palms to hers and laced fingers. "You mean I could settle for a facsimile of you via Roberta, and you could settle for a facsimile of me with Kevin?" he asked in the same tone he used that sounded like he really wanted to say, "Checkmate." She laughed softly. He did make her laugh, maybe unintentionally. He joined her in her amusement. "You think I like you because you and Kevin have some similar qualities?" she asked. "That's preposterous. I liked Kevin first." Darkness flickered in his eyes for a second, but otherwise he did not flinch. He bowed his head but did not take his eyes off of her. "So you admit," he began darkly, "that you like me?" She shrugged. "I like you some," she said softly. He bowed. "Milady, you have given me an amazing gift on this day." The horse-drawn carriage clip-clopped from the carriage house behind the mansion. Without asking, Derek hoisted Gwen up to the carriage and followed in beside her. Without any spoken instruction, the driver signaled the horse to proceed. Derek and Gwen rode the grounds of Brightston Mansion. The bright blue sky peeking through the raking fingers of the lush trees dulled over with the haze of humidity. Gwen flicked a fan at her face because the dress was becoming unbearably hot. Her hairline was damp. Despite the breeze generated by the motion of the carriage, she was terribly uncomfortable. The heat would break soon, for a storm was building. At first, Gwen thought she heard thunder, but it was more of that muffled speaking that filtered its way through dimensions. "Derek," she whispered weakly, "I am not accustomed to this living or living without air conditioning." "Ah, fair lady," he said sympathetically, "let us take this party indoors." Gwen could hardly walk. She was wilted so. The faintness from the heat and the heaviness of the dress was a bad combination. Derek directed the driver to pull up to the front door of the mansion. He dismounted from the carriage with ease. The heat peaked insufferably, thunder growling in the sky. He offered Gwen his hand, which she took, and without warning or request, he lifted her from the carriage and walked her into the house, the doors to which servants opened for him, draped over his arms. Mercifully, the interior of the house was equipped with modern conveniences, and air conditioning was one of them. In an instant, she felt herself recovering from the dreadful heat. Derek placed her on a sofa like she was a patient and not a guest. "Better?" he asked. A servant shadowed him with a tray of iced drinks. Gwen sat up. "Please, dear lady," implored Derek, his language becoming more and more arcane. "Please remain in repose." "I'm much better," she assured him, recalling so acutely the way it felt to be in his very powerful arms. At the moment, she could not remember what she found so objectionable about him. He certainly was a good-looking, charming fellow. It seemed like every detail about her well-being pained him. "You do care for me, don't you?" she asked, liking the idea that a man had those kinds of feelings for her. "I do indeed," he affirmed. The sounds of conversations from another realm interrupted their meaningful conversation. His expression morphed from warm and attentive to pure alarm. He had the air of a man afraid of being caught. But what exactly was he up to? "Derek, are you concerned that after tonight, and I am returned home to my friends and family, that I won't want to associate with you?" she asked gently. He arched his brow. "You said as much, milady." "Well, I apologize," she said. "I just wanted to spare my grandmother's feelings. Her affections for you were getting the better of her. I had to protect her." "I understand," he said. And with emotion, he communicated with a servant who departed the room and returned with a fluted glass filled with ice cream, decorated with a sprig of mint. Derek lifted the glass from the tray and fed the delicious homemade dessert to Gwen herself. She had no defense against that. He was completely inoculating her with full-blown attraction. Who but Derek knew that she was so vulnerable to such attentions? Gwen was completely disarmed. "This way," she heard someone say. She knew that voice. She couldn't quite place it, but it was familiar to her. Derek set the glass aside, for it was empty. A trio appeared in the corner of the parlor and began to play what Gwen knew were Baroque classics. "Do you feel up to dancing?" he asked with a slight bow. "I am not sure I know how to dance to this, though it's lovely," she said, her heart brimming with a new-found affection for him. "I shall be pleased to teach you," he offered, and she accepted his hand. Dancing! How she had longed to dance with Kevin at one time. Derek was more than an adequate teacher. He was strong and guided her motion so that even though she was unfamiliar with the steps, she moved with grace and smoothness. It looked like she had been dancing all her life. "This is wonderful," she gushed. "See? And you rebuffed me." "I apologize," she whispered. "No need," he whispered back. "I would not have had it any other way." The thunder rumbled once again, but this time it didn't sound quite like thunder after all. More like footsteps landing with force as if running. It was a squad of them, as far as she could tell. "What's going on?" she asked, unable to focus on the music or the moment. It sounded so strange. "I don't know what you mean," he said. She studied him. He was clearly lying, and for someone so charming and manipulative, it was odd that he was such a bad liar. "You know what I mean," she challenged. The spell of the moment cracked and weakened. Then something occurred to her. "So, if Grandma Robbie and Kevin put me in this alternate realm, how is it you are the only person from the outside who can move in and out of the warp?" she asked with crystal clarity. Derek laughed nervously. "Take me back. Now," she ordered. Chapter 12. "Grandma Robbie!" she shouted. "Gwendolyn!" Derek implored. Quin hoisted her skirts just enough so that she could maneuver better. "Where's the kitchen?" she asked the first servant she encountered. The poor soul merely pointed and said nothing. Gwen followed his direction. Derek was close behind. "What do you need the kitchen for?" he demanded. The kitchen, Gwen could determine, having been on the grounds via the carriage, was including the house in one of the many renovations. The door outside from it had been cut within the last 100 years, she estimated, and it led to the original kitchen outside of the house. She removed a pair of cooking shears from the knife block and held them up, snipping them suggestively. Derek gasped in horror. "Don't think I won't," she replied, and she grabbed a clump of fabric, cutting it at her knees. "What are you doing?" he demanded. "No, that's imported silk." "It still is," Gwen said. "Only shorter." She snipped the fabric and merely tugged it for expediency. Otherwise, she would be cutting forever, and she had lost all her impatience. "I cannot believe you would let a few white lies get in the way of a perfectly wonderful evening," he began. "Spare me, Casanova," she replied and pointed the shears in his direction. "Show me the way out of here. Now." "I don't have to," he smiled, very pleased with himself. "I can keep you here as long as I like, and if anyone else finds their way in, I can do the same to them. I wouldn't beckon them again." Gwen looked around at all the servants. There were a lot of them, and they were more or less just walking around with trays and other implements, not really doing anything. "Are these people stuck here too?" she barked. He shrugged like it amused him. "You're to let them go," she said. "Big words from a little girl who can't find her way home," he said smugly. Gwen was about to blow her lid and throw the biggest tantrum of her life when Divinity's words counseled her. Nice and easy does it every time. It was a rephrasing of Grandma Robbie's admonition to keep cool and let the magic work. That was her solution. She was going to make Derek angry so as to weaken him. "I guess I just love talking," she trolled. His face spread with flattery. "Love?" he asked. "Do you think you love me, or could love me?" Heck no, she waved him off. I was talking about Kevin. I think this time with you really drove it home to me that I do love him. Derek boiled. Gwen knew that he didn't want her. He wanted her to want him. There were a lot of women servants spinning their wheels in this realm, and many of them young and beautiful. No doubt they fell prey to his charms. Yeah, I don't want you, she reiterated. I just want to go home. I'll wait. She picked up the portion of the dress she cut and walked it over to the nearest fireplace. Derek looked on in absolute horror. She pulled the pins from her hair and unraveled the style until her locks were long and tousled. I am going to at least bring myself into the century, she remarked with total calm. The calmer she was, the more upset he became. Gwen, Kevin called to her, and her heart leaped. For a moment, her cool persona was interrupted. As she was disheveled, Derek became extremely sure. Answer him, and I will trap him in this realm forever, Derek threatened. Did you enjoy the game of luring me to you with a deal? Asked Gwen. Big man. That's quite enough, Gwen, he said. By the way, I don't need you to tell me where the opening is, she fibbed. I can see it in my mind's eye. Gwen inched slowly to the back door, and when she had her chance, she ran. Derek furiously pursued her. She darted in and out of trees, knowing she wouldn't be able to keep the speed forever. She made it around to the front of the house, climbed onto the carriage, and begged the driver to move it. The carriage zipped right by Derek as he caught up to her. He grasped at the carriage, but it was too late. Gwen was moving fast now. As the driver made his way to the main road, servants piled on. It was like they were dropping out of the sky. The one that sat right next to her was the maid. She turned to Gwen. I know where to go, she said, and directed the driver. Gwen felt an environmental flinch, and she was now on a horse-drawn carriage in Derek's yard, but it was filled with the people from the town of Green. The carriage came to a halt. Kevin Pearson turned, and Gwen went flying into his arms. Blue jumped off of the seat beside her. Grandma Robbie's face was bright as her voice crumpled with emotion. Oh, my word! There you are, girl, she said to her cat. Gwen laughed because, at first, she thought her grandmother was talking about her. She wasn't too hurt that her grandmother missed the cat more than she missed her, for it felt too amazing to be in Kevin's embrace. He held her practically midair. Gwen's eyes fixed on an old man scowling at her from his seat on a picnic bench. It was Derek. The party was going on as planned. The members of the welcoming committee each had the same pleased smile plastered on their faces. Kevin lowered her down finally. He cupped her head with his giant, powerful hands. Are you okay? He asked. I'm fine now, she said. I want to go home. She felt a hand on her shoulder. Yes, let's go home, said Grandma Robbie. No one will miss us here. Where is Emmy? Asked Gwen as her grandmother and Kevin walked toward the Buick. And Divinity? Where did all these people come from? Asked Grandma Robbie, stopping mid-step. Gwen scanned the crowd. A handful of geriatric guests lifted their eyes to her. They were the servants now enjoying themselves at a party. Not as servants, but as guests. They nodded at her. Wherever, Gram, said Gwen. They aren't going back. It was only just a bit longer to the car. Gwen noticed Kevin's eyes fixed on her dress, his expression one of puzzlement. She laughed. I'll explain, she promised, not able to let go of his hand. She opened the driver's side of the Buick and slid in the bench seat. Blue hopped in and sat squarely on Gwen's lap. She looked at Gwen, and without a word exchanged between them, Gwen knew. It all made sense to her. She touched the velvet collar around the cat's neck and held the pendant that said her name. Blue. Where do you want to go? Gwen asked her. The cat settled down as Gram got behind the wheel, and Kevin squeezed into the passenger seat beside her. Everyone buckled up as the Buick pulled out of the long and winding driveway out to the highway that took them back into the town of Green. Gwen looked over her shoulder one last time before Graham headed down Foothills. There was no party. The house was vacant, and the caravan of trucks was lined up as though they were waiting for the next business day for work to begin. At once, Gwen was seized with the fear that she had entered another warp. Before she knew it, the Buick was easing into her driveway. She would deal with her fears once she was safely inside. "I cannot tell you how much I miss this place," she said. Grandma Robbie took her hands. "I missed you," she said, and embraced her. Kevin wrapped his enormous arms around the both of them. "That was a close one," he said. "But you're back where you belong." "I'm starved," said Grandma Robbie. "I'm ordering food." Now Gwen really suspected she was back in a warp. "Why?" She grabbed her grandmother. Grandma Robbie read her mind, as usual. "Relax, dear," she said. "We're fine. We're safe. It's over. Pineapple and ham, dear?" "Mushrooms, green peppers, and onions," Gwen answered quickly. "Someone doesn't have a date," Grandma Robbie joked. It was the joke she made whenever one of them ate onions. "Yes, she does," Kevin retorted, squeezing Gwen's hand. They all settled into the living room while Grandma Robbie phoned in the order. The only Italian place around was Mario's, and Gwen was uncomfortable. "We'll heal that with a new experience," Grandma Robbie said, without Gwen having to explain. It was her grandmother, Gwen was sure. Blue hopped up onto a padded rocker. Grandma Robbie drew down the crocheted blanket and tucked it around Gwen. Gwen looked beyond her grandmother, through the living room window to outside. "Is it snowing?" asked Gwen with surprise. Grandma Robbie shrugged sheepishly. "I thought it would be cozier," she replied. "Kevin, can you light a fire?" "I sure can," he answered eagerly. "No argument," Gwen said with a smile. "Where's Divinity? At Ammy's?" Grandma Robbie and Kevin exchanged looks like there was a secret. "Yeah," said Kevin hesitantly. "We think so." Gwen touched her fingers to her forehead. Grandma Robbie placed a calming hand on her. "We'll find him, dear," she said. "He lost because of me," said Gwen. "He was able to go in and out of the realms." "And we were very appreciative," said Grandma Robbie softly. "No one is ever lost." "Yeah, if it weren't for him," said Kevin, rubbing his hands before the fire as though it were winter, "we wouldn't have figured out the whole story." "Derek said you put me in that realm to keep me away from him," said Gwen. "If I hadn't believed he really wanted me after all, I wouldn't have been such a sucker." "We all believed that," said Grandma Robbie with a sigh. "Flattery is the worst black magic of all." "He craved it," said Gwen. "That's the only thing he wanted, was to be the center of everyone's attention. And that little kitten risked everything." She choked up momentarily so no words could come out. When she collected herself, she looked at Blue. "She wasn't the only one," said Gwen. "Our sweet Blue also sacrificed a lot." "She's going to be nothing but pampered from here on out," said Grandma Robbie. "That makes two of you," Kevin said, gazing at Gwen. "Say, do you want to get a coat on and go outside to wait for the pizza guy?" "Go on, dear," Grandma Robbie whispered. Gwen went to the coat closet and slipped on her boots. She borrowed Grandma Robbie's ancient ankle-length leather trencher. "What about you?" she asked Kevin. "I'll be fine," he said. They stepped outside. The night had arrived, and the snow was positively magical, even if it was in the middle of the late spring. Quin was confident that her grandmother had brought the unseasonal weather in such a way that no life would be harmed. Even Kevin was spared. He wasn't even shivering. "Say, listen," he said, as he dug his hands into the pocket of his jeans. "I want to apologize." For? She asked. For being a lunkhead, he said. I'm sorry if I ever took you for granted. When I thought of that old geezer holding you captive, it was so weird, she said. He wasn't old when I saw him until the last. He was super ancient at the party before it disappeared. That's how we saw him, he said. Although your grandmother swore he was a young man too at times, I never saw it. Gwen laughed softly. I don't guess you would, she said. How's that? Asked Kevin. I think it may be a female thing, said Gwen. She removed her phone from her pocket and pulled up the picture she had taken of Grandma Robbie just to see if it had changed any. There in the streetlight was a lovely picture of her grandmother when she was just a little bit younger than Gwen. She was really beautiful. See? She held her phone up for Kevin to see. Is that you? He asked. Nope, she said. That's Grandma Robbie. That's what she became around Derek. She had her hopes up so. Well, that's all over now, said Kevin. We'll never let anything or anyone like that come between us again. Us? Asked Gwen, looking up at him. Us meaning you, me, and Graham, or you and me? He was about to answer that question when music off in the distance interrupted. Kevin and Gwen looked to the horizon as a shiny black vintage car rolled up the street toward Grandma Robbie's house. Despite the snowy weather, the streets were clear, and the driver's windows were down. I know that song, said Gwen, on alert. It's nice and easy, said Kevin. Gwen thought he was telling her to calm down, so she repeated herself, only more slowly. I know that song, she said more deliberately. It's nice and easy, said Kevin. Gwen blinked at him, not understanding what he was saying until she did. She laughed at herself. I might be a first-class dork, she said. That's the song that Divinity always quotes. Your kitten quotes Old Blue Eyes? He laughed. Figures. The vintage Cadillac had a Mario sign on top and a Mario's magnet on the door. Good night, said Gwen. Beautiful car. Not sure I would put magnets on that thing or use it as a delivery vehicle, Kevin remarked. The driver eased in front of the house, parked, and walked around the car to the passenger side like he was getting the door for someone. He wore peg-leg jeans and a black cardigan over a white t-shirt. He looked like he stepped out of another decade. This just keeps happening and happening, muttered Gwen. Her apprehension was dissolved when the driver, a young man, flashed a brilliant smile. The smile disclosed what Gwen believed was a sweet soul. This was a nice human being, and his enthusiasm for his job was heartwarming. Do you have any cash? Whispered Gwen. Grandma Robbie came to the door, knowing exactly what was needed. The pizza guy handed Kevin the boxes while Grandma Robbie reached through the door and handed him a 20. I don't have any change, the guy said with a heavy New Jersey accent. Gwen nodded and smiled. Say, what's your name? She asked him. Folks just call me Dee, he said, flashing a smile. So very nice to meet you, she said, choking up. Thank you. Hey, nice and easy does it every time, he said, and tipped a phantom hat. Thank you, Dee, said Gwen. Gwen held on to Kevin as they went into the house and sat at the table with Grandma Robbie, who had set it for dinner. It was nice to be home. We can go to the shelter and get another kitten when you're ready, if we can't find the little guy, said Kevin. Gwen looked over to Blue. We're just fine, she said. Everything is as it should be. The end. The Bin Cat to the Chase. The Hill Cozy Mystery. Cozy Hill Mystery Series Book 3. Written by Catherine Waltan. Narrated by Allison Liu. Copyright 2021 by Catherine Waltan. Production copyright by Catherine Waltan.